crowd's anxiety was palpable, their markings pulsing in rapid, discordant patterns. "I would never endanger your people," Riker said firmly. "The Phantom remained in his territory. He has no interest in the village." Korath scoffed.
Dos contre le sol en métal dur. La lumière tamisée au plafond clignotait, projetant des ombres allongées et sinistres sur les murs vides. Ses poignets pulsaient là où les entraves les avaient précédemment constrictes, bien qu'elles aient été légèrement desserrées, une concession mineure compte tenu de son statut de prisonnier de l'Empire Varak, une espèce notoire pour sa discipline militaire stricte et son animosité profonde envers la défiance humaine. Il expira brusquement et se redressa, roulant son épaule pour soulager la raideur. De l'autre côté de la pièce, au-delà des barres énergétiques de sa cellule, se tenait sa gardienne silencieuse, exactement à l'endroit où elle se trouvait toujours, l'observant de ses yeux argentés sans clignement. Elle ne parlait jamais, ne réagissait jamais, elle se tenait simplement là, une force inflexible, semblable à une statue taillée dans une pierre extraterrestre. Jared avait épuisé tous les moyens pour obtenir une réponse de sa part au cours des semaines précédentes, blagues, provocations, même feignant la déliquescence due à la faim, mais n'avait reçu aucune parole. C'était presque impressionnant. Il étendit les bras avec un gémissement exagéré et jeta un coup d'œil vers elle, en remarquant « Bonjour, rayon de soleil », tout en se frottant l'arrière du cou. Où est-ce le soir? C'est difficile à discerner dans cet endroit. Ce ne sont pas exactement des hébergements 5 étoiles, n'est-ce pas? Pensez-vous que je pourrais obtenir une fenêtre? Peut-être un éclairage ambiant, une plante en pot et du silence. Il expira bruyamment et s'appuya contre le mur. Le public ne réagissait pas, elle n'a même pas bronché. C'était presque une provocation, pourrait-il percer cette façade glaciale? Il l'examina comme il l'avait fait à de nombreuses reprises auparavant, notant sa taille, qui était considérable même selon les normes humaines. Sa silhouette de guerrière, enveloppée dans une armure sombre qui adhérait à elle comme une seconde peau, mettait en valeur son teint d'obsidienne brillant. Dans la lumière tamisée, un contraste frappant émergeait avec la luminescence argentée de ses yeux, complétée par ses oreilles allongées et pointues qui tressautaient imperceptiblement alors qu'il parlait, semblant filtrer ses mots à la recherche d'une précieuse perspicacité. « Allez », pressa Jared en inclinant la tête. « Nous sommes engagés là-dedans depuis des semaines, ne pouvons-nous pas simplement feindre la familiarité comme de vieux amis? Peut-être pourriez-vous révéler votre nom, et je pourrais partager le mien, ce qui nous permettrait de nous connecter sur nos situations lamentables. » Non, il n'y a toujours rien. Jared sourit et proposa, « Frappe une fois si tu m'aimes, 2 fois si tu m'adores. » Son expression resta impassible, et sa posture était aussi droite que jamais. Il a ri, affirmant, « Le fait que tu n'as pas frappé indique que tu y penses. » Un léger éclat, à peine un changement subtil dans son attitude qu'il avait presque négligé, suggérait de l'amusement, pourtant, cela ne pouvait pas être, il l'imaginait simplement. Jared s'essuya le visage et dit, « Je perds la tête, c'est ce qui se passe. » Un homme peut se parler à lui-même seulement pendant un temps limité avant de commencer à entendre des choses. Une faible cloche résonna dans le couloir alors que la porte fortifiée de sa cellule s'ouvrait. 2 autres gardes Varak arrivèrent, tous 2 des figures imposantes ornées de la même armure sombre que son gardien. Contrairement à elle, cependant, il n'était pas silencieux, l'un d'eux lui grogna dessus, « Lève-toi, humain. » Jared leva un sourcil. « Ah, fantastique. Je venais justement de réfléchir à combien j'aimais être escorté par vous tous, c'était toujours un moment fort de ma journée. » Le garde saisit son bras et le tira sur ses pieds. Jared grimaça mais maintint son sarcasme. Doucement, les muscles, je me contusionne comme une pêche. Il le traînait à moitié, le poussait à moitié à travers les couloirs stériles de l'installation, où l'air empestait le métal et l'ozone, et le bourdonnement des machines était un fond sonore constant. Il comptait les tournants, mémorisant le chemin. Bien qu'il n'ait pas encore formulé de plan d'évasion concret, il était prudent d'être préparé. Ils l'ont escorté dans une pièce sombre, dépourvue de meubles à l'exception d'une chaise en métal fixée au sol et d'une table ornée d'équipements menaçants. Jared grogna, encore une interrogation? Vous avez tous vraiment besoin de vous trouver de nouveaux passe-temps. Le garde principal le plaça de force dans la chaise, attachant ses menottes aux accoudoirs avant de sortir, la porte se fermant avec un sifflement derrière eux. Jared s'affaissa et déclara, « Très bien, procédons. » Qui est l'interrogateur chanceux d'aujourd'hui? Après un moment de silence, à sa grande surprise, sa gardienne émergea des ombres de la pièce, seule, sans aucune aide ou officier supérieur présent, juste elle. Jared fronça les sourcils, remarquant la nouveauté de la situation. Habituellement, elle se contentait de le fixer de loin. Elle resta immobile pendant un long moment avant d'avancer lentement d'un pas. L'humeur de Jared vacilla, il y avait quelque chose d'inhabituel chez elle ce soir. Ses mains étaient serrées à ses côtés, comme si elle luttait contre une lutte invisible. Avant qu'il ne puisse pleinement comprendre la situation, elle se pencha juste assez près pour qu'il puisse l'entendre, et d'une voix si douce qu'il crut presque l'avoir imaginée, elle murmura « Je suis interdite de parler aux prisonniers, mais je t'aime, humain. » Jared fixa ses lèvres légèrement entr'ouvertes, contemplant les événements inattendus de la soirée. Jared resta immobilisé dans la chaise d'interrogatoire, ses pensées dans un chaos total. Il avait anticipé la torture, la manipulation psychologique et d'autres menaces, mais c'était une expérience tout à fait différente. Il cligna des yeux en la regardant, sa gardienne. Son geôlier silencieux et toujours vigilant, le guerrier aux yeux d'argent et à la posture si rigide qu'elle pouvait soutenir une structure en train de s'effondrer, venait de prononcer la déclaration la plus absurde qu'il ait jamais entendue. Jared se racla la gorge, tentant d'articuler ses pensées. D'accord, juste pour être clair, vous avez bien dit ce que je crois que vous avez dit, n'est-ce pas? Ce n'était pas une hallucination bizarre induite par la malnutrition, ni suis-je interdite de converser avec des prisonniers. Elle réitéra, sa voix plus douce cette fois, comme si cela lui faisait mal de le répéter, mais je t'aime, humain. La bouche de Jared s'ouvrit puis se ferma alors qu'il se penchait légèrement en avant, baissant la voix. Vous vous rendez compte que ce n'est pas un comportement typique pour un prisonnier? Le directeur conversait tandis que ses doigts tressautaient à ses côtés, un mouvement subtil, mais c'était la première indication sincère d'émotion qu'il avait observée chez elle. Elle resta immobile, à l'exception de ses oreilles allongées qui frémirent légèrement, à l'écoute des sons ambiants de l'établissement qui les entourait. Jared humecta su labio, reconociendo la necesidad de ser cauteloso, solo había una poca explicación plausible para la situation, ninguna de las cuales era particulièrement très confortante. Option 1, c'était un test, un piégeage psychologique conçu pour observer sa réaction s'il baissait sa garde, potentiellement pour être exploité contre lui. Option 2, elle avait récemment subi une forme de traumatisme crânien, possiblement due à une exposition à des substances extraterrestres expérimentales. Option 3, elle était vraiment sérieuse, et c'était la perspective la plus redoutable de toutes. Jared expira, passant une main dans ses cheveux. D'accord, j'apprécie le geste, je l'apprécie vraiment, mais nous avons un problème ici. Vous êtes mon ravisseur, et je suis votre prisonnier. À moins que les Varak n'aient soudainement mis en place une politique de « tomber amoureux de l'ennemi », pendant que j'étais inconsciente, je vais supposer que... C'est fortement mal vu dans votre culture, dit-elle en tournant légèrement la tête comme si elle écoutait des pas approchants, puis sans un mot de plus, elle avança si rapidement que Jared à peine eut le temps de tressaillir avant qu'elle ne soit juste devant lui. Le pouls de Jared s'accéléra. Sa main flottait près des menottes à ses poignets, ses yeux argentés se levant pour croiser les siens, il vit quelque chose en eux, de l'hésitation peut-être, voire de la peur, non pas de lui mais de quelque chose de plus grand, quelque chose en dehors de cette pièce, et puis d'un geste rapide elle appuya sur un bouton sur le panneau à côté de lui. Jared sentit les menottes se déverrouiller, son cœur faillit s'arrêter. Il plia les doigts, clignant des yeux sur ses mains nouvellement libérées, puis il la regarda. Es-tu sûr que tu es censé faire ça? Elle ne répondit pas, mais recula en jetant un coup d'œil à la porte. Viens. Jared hésita, tu sais, généralement quand quelqu'un dit je t'aime, il y a un peu plus de préparation avant qu'on ne parte ensemble pour une audacieuse évasion de prison. Elle expira bruyamment par le nez, était-ce la version VRA d'un soupir agacé? Bouge rapidement, humain. Jared se leva, roulant ses épaules raides, initialement perplexe par ses émotions. Elle le guida jusqu'à la porte, jetant un coup d'œil des deux côtés avant d'entrer dans le couloir. Jared la suivit de près, malgré son incertitude quant à sa confiance en elle. Manquant d'armes et de plans, il comptait uniquement sur la guerrière stoïque qui l'avait protégé pendant des semaines comme un sentinelle impassible. Il se déplaçait rapidement à travers les couloirs faiblement éclairés, ses mouvements précis et efficaces. Jared était étonné par sa capacité à naviguer dans l'installation, évitant les angles morts de sécurité comme si elle les avait mémorisés méticuleusement. Après quelques virages, il rompit enfin le silence en demandant « Alors, quel est le deal ici ?» Je suppose que ce n'est pas un test élaboré de mes réflexes. Elle continua de marcher, en disant « Il n'y a pas de temps pour les explications. » Jared exhala de frustration, commentant sur la commodité de la situation. Elle s'arrêta soudainement et se tourna vers lui, disant « Il est temps que tu survives. » Jared ouvrit la bouche mais la referma ensuite, incapable de contester la logique présentée. Ils avancèrent dans un autre couloir, mais alors qu'ils approchaient d'une intersection, elle le poussa brusquement contre le mur, son corps protégeant le sien. Le souffle de Jared se coupa, si l'intimité était l'objectif, une approche plus directe aurait suffi. Une patrouille de 3 gardes passa, leurs bottes résonnant contre le sol en métal. Jared retint son souffle alors qu'ils passaient, sans même jeter un coup d'œil dans leur direction. Une fois qu'ils furent partis, elle recula, lui conseillant de s'abstenir de parler sauf si c'était absolument nécessaire. Jared lui lança un regard modeste. Elle a défini la nécessité, en plissant les yeux vers lui. Compris, moins de conversation, plus d'évasion. Ils avancèrent, évitant habilement les patrouilles et les drones de surveillance. À mesure qu'ils descendaient plus loin, il devenait de plus en plus évident qu'elle ne se contentait pas de conjecturer, elle possédait une connaissance intime de l'installation. Finalement, ils arrivèrent à ce qui semblait être une petite trappe de maintenance. Elle activa le panneau adjacent, et la porte s'ouvrit, révélant un tunnel étroit. Jared jeta un coup d'œil à l'intérieur, contemplant l'absurdité de ramper à travers des conduits rappelant les vieux films de science-fiction, qui dépeignaient toujours la tâche comme étant trompeusement simple. Elle ignora ses réflexions et entra dans l'espace, ce qui le poussa à soupirer et à la suivre, tentant de réprimer ses pensées sur le fait de traverser le territoire ennemi aux côtés d'une guerrière extraterrestre qui venait de lui avouer son affection lors d'un interrogatoire. Ce n'était certainement pas ainsi qu'il avait imaginé le déroulement de sa journée. Ils ont rampé pendant ce qui semblait une éternité avant d'émerger dans une salle de stockage, où une petite navette de transport laissée sans surveillance était garée au centre de la pièce. Les sourcils de Jared se levèrent d'incrédulité. « Tu rigoles, tu es en train de voler un vaisseau ?» Elle se tourna vers lui, interrogative, « Tu ne souhaites pas t'échapper ?» Jared leva les mains en signe de reddition. Aucune objection ici, je ne m'attendais simplement pas à ce que notre plan maître implique de prendre le contrôle d'un vaisseau au hasard et d'espérer le meilleur. Elle s'approcha de la navette et activa les commandes de la trappe, ce n'est pas arbitraire. Jared la suivit en secouant la tête, bien sûr que ce n'est pas parce que tu as planifié ça des semaines à l'avance. Je suppose même plus longtemps, elle n'a pas répondu mais le regard qu'elle lui a lancé en disait long. Jared laissa échapper un sifflement bas. Waouh, tu m'aimes vraiment, hein? Elle jeta un coup d'œil vers les portes. Nous devons partir maintenant. Jared sourit en montant à bord du vaisseau. Tu sais, si tu voulais un premier rendez-vous, tu aurais pu simplement demander. Son regard perçant se tourna vers lui. Asseyez-vous. Jared sourit et répondit, oui, madame, alors que la navette se mettait en marche et que des alarmes retentissaient autour de l'installation. Jared s'est attaché, regardant la prendre les commandes, il n'avait aucune idée de leur destination, pourquoi elle faisait cela ou ce qui allait suivre, mais une chose était claire, sa vie venait de devenir beaucoup plus compliquée. Malgré la pression atmosphérique, la sirène continuait de retentir derrière eux, signalant leur évasion à chaque vaisseau et patrouille à proximité. Jared se sécurisa en attachant la ceinture de sécurité tandis que la guerrière extraterrestre à côté de lui manœuvrait les commandes avec une précision mécanique méticuleuse. Il ignorait leur destination, la stratégie ou la logique derrière ses actions, cependant, un fait était indéniable, son pilotage habile indiquait que ce n'était pas un choix spontané, elle avait déjà exécuté cette manœuvre auparavant. Jared murmura, lui lançant un coup d'œil alors qu'elle modifiait leur trajectoire tout en dérobant des vaisseaux pour échapper à l'arrestation. « Tu es une fugitive professionnelle, n'est-ce pas ?» Ses yeux argentés croisèrent brièvement les siens alors qu'elle détournait son attention vers les commandes. « Je ne suis pas un fugitif, en fait, c'est moi qui suis poursuivi dans ce contexte. » Jared remarqua, en ajustant sa position dans son siège, « Mais si vous aidez un fugitif, cela ne vous rend-il pas fugitif par association ?» Ses oreilles allongées tremblèrent subtilement, suggérant que ce dialogue était plus exaspérant que leur véritable situation de vie ou de mort. Je ne suis pas une fugitive. Elle a réitéré, cette fois avec un air de finalité, compris, pas un fugitif. Jared observa, en s'allongeant, qu'il n'était qu'un citoyen ordinaire respectueux des lois qui, en même temps, extrayait un prisonnier d'une installation militaire ennemie et s'appropriait des biens gouvernementaux. Elle resta silencieuse, le seul son entre eux étant le bourdonnement constant des moteurs de la navette alors qu'ils montaient, pénétrant les couches denses de l'atmosphère de la planète. Jared expira, concédant, « Très bien, nous y reviendrons plus tard. » Une question plus urgente est, où ? Traversons-nous le cercle extérieur de ce système ? Il existe une région aveugle au-delà de la deuxième lune, sans patrouilles immédiates présentes. Excellent. Jared a déclaré que nous ne nous cachons que dans une région arbitraire de l'espace. Elle a répondu en modifiant la trajectoire du vaisseau, indiquant qu'elle avait besoin de temps pour communiquer avec un vaisseau spatial qui nous transportera hors de la planète. Jared fronça les sourcils, indiquant que quelqu'un nous attendait. Elle ne répondit pas, ce qui devenait une habitude. Jared inclina la tête contre le siège et soupira, contemplant le plan d'évasion énigmatique et le rendez-vous confidentiel, tout en reconnaissant qu'il ne connaissait toujours pas le nom de l'autre personne. Cette fois, elle hésita, sa prise sur les commandes se resserrant légèrement. « Ziren », répondit-elle enfin. Jared cligna des yeux, contemplant le nom tout en testant la résonance sur sa langue. Pas mal, fort, guerrier, très approprié. Cependant, j'ai maintenant des questions de suivi, comme pourquoi risquerais-tu tout pour moi, Zien ? Bien que je reconnaisse mon charme considérable, il se traduit généralement par des boissons gratuites au bar plutôt que par l'organisation d'évasions élaborées de prison. Zien resta silencieuse, ses yeux d'argent fixés sur l'écran devant elle, examinant méticuleusement l'environnement à la recherche d'indications de poursuite. Jared expira bruyamment, tapotant ses doigts sur son genou tout en gardant une attitude énigmatique. « Cool, remarqua-t-il, mais à un moment donné, tu devras me donner quelque chose sur quoi travailler. » Elle persistait à modifier leur trajectoire, ignorant complètement ses remarques. Jared se massait les tempes, notant que la plupart des gens s'engagent souvent dans une certaine flirtation avant de déclarer leur affection et de lancer une mission d'évasion interstellaire. Vous semblez avoir sauté plusieurs étapes. Je n'avais pas l'intention de... Zien interrompit brusquement sa déclaration, son attitude devenant rigide. Jared haussait un sourcil, réalisant qu'il avait fait une erreur en parlant alors que sa mâchoire se crispait. Il se redressa légèrement, l'observant pour la première fois depuis le début de cette situation. Elle semblait troublée, ni en colère ni froide, mais incertaine. Une pensée lui traversa l'esprit. Étais-tu surprise par ce que tu as dit plus tôt ? Les mains de Zien se figèrent sur les commandes. Jared émit un sifflement étouffé. Oh, comme c'est étonnant. Ce n'était pas un élément d'un grand plan, tu n'avais vraiment pas l'intention de le vocaliser. Les yeux argentés de Xiron se fixèrent sur lui. Aigu et illisible, Jared leva les mains, s'exclamant « Ne me regarde pas de cette manière, je ne fais que rassembler les faits. » Tu étais là, dégageant une aura de sérieux et d'intimidation, et puis, soudainement, je t'ai avoué mon amour. Zien inspira profondément par les narines. Jared sourit en coin, avoue-le, tu t'es choqué toi-même, n'est-ce pas ? Elle exhala lentement, comme si elle hésitait à le lancer dans la première écoutille venue. Je ne souhaite pas en discuter, n'est-ce pas ? Jared sourit, affirmant que discuter des émotions est sans aucun doute l'aspect le plus désagréable de leur situation, plutôt que leur véritable statut de fugitif. Les doigts de Xen se crispèrent, et pendant un bref instant, Jared craignit qu'elle ne l'étrangle. À la place, elle détourna son attention vers les commandes. Son expression était de nouveau impénétrable. Jared déclara, en s'allongeant, que nous nous abstiendrions d'en discuter pour le moment. Néanmoins, il me rassura en disant qu'il reviendrait certainement sur le sujet plus tard. Par la suite, Zien resta silencieuse, mais Jared aurait juré avoir vu ses oreilles tressaillir à nouveau. Leur navette pénétra finalement les dernières couches de l'atmosphère de la planète, entrant dans le vide infini de l'espace. Les alarmes de l'installation s'éloignèrent dans la distance, et pour la première fois depuis le début de ce tumulte, il semblait qu'ils avaient un moment pour respirer. Jared respira en regardant les étoiles. C'était une soirée plutôt mouvementée. Zian le fixa, en remarquant, tu as tendance à minimiser les situations graves. Jared sourit, notant que la détention militaire prolongée favorise l'appréciation des petites victoires, comme celle de s'en sortir indemne. Sans aucun doute une victoire à mon avis. Zian est revenu aux commandes, nous ne sommes pas encore en sécurité. Oui, j'avais deviné autant. Jared remarqua en posant sa tête sur le siège, mais un pas à la fois, n'est-ce pas? Zian ne répondit pas, mais, alors que la navette s'aventurait plus loin dans l'immensité sereine de l'espace, sa prise sur les commandes se relâcha progressivement. Jared ferma les yeux, laissant la fatigue le submerger. Il sentait que ce n'était que le début. Le bourdonnement de la navette volée résonnait dans la cabine exiguë tandis que Jared étendait ses jambes, craquant son cou contre le siège rigide. Les heures précédentes avaient été un brouillard d'évasion et de péril, culminant dans la révélation que son ravisseur devenu sauveur possédait l'aptitude sociale d'un drone de guerre défectueux. Zian occupait le poste de pilotage, ses yeux argentés scrutant méticuleusement les cartes stellaires tandis que ses doigts naviguaient avec précision sur le panneau de contrôle. Elle était restée largement silencieuse depuis leur évasion, n'offrant que des ordres ou des mises en garde sporadiques. Jared n'était pas sûr si elle était plongée dans la contemplation ou si elle l'ignorait délibérément, alors il rompit le silence en demandant « Quel est notre plan maintenant que nous ne sommes plus en danger immédiat ? Je présume que nous ne pouvons pas simplement nous arrêter et nous reposer. » Zian ne croisa pas son regard. « Nous attendons l'arrivée de mon contact, ils faciliteront notre départ de ce monde. » « Ah, un contact ?» répondit Jared en hochant la tête. Mystérieux, énigmatique, probablement assez sérieux. Laissez-moi deviner, un individu redoutable vêtu de noir qui n'apprécie pas l'humour? Le doigt de Xiron s'arrêta pendant une demi-seconde. Elle n'est pas grande, remarqua Jared avec un sourire. Ah, donc c'est une femelle. Comme c'est intrigant. Sera-t-elle contente que tu aies récupéré un humain égaré? Zian finit par tourner la tête, lui offrant une expression impénétrable. Elle ne sera pas étonnée. Jared fronça les sourcils, remettant en question le ton sinistre, mais avant que Zian ne puisse répondre, une alerte résonna dans le cockpit, un avertissement de proximité. Jared se redressa promptement, son attitude détendue. Venez, veuillez confirmer que c'est votre contact et non un cuirassé qui s'approche pour nous incinérer. Zian a examiné les relevés et a déclaré que ce n'était pas un cuirassé. Jared exhala, exprimant de l'enthousiasme, mais Zian hésita, incertain de l'identité. Jared exprima son mécontentement, déclarant que cette situation est bien pire que de simplement lui annoncer une mauvaise nouvelle. Les capteurs de la navette émirent un autre signal, révélant une forme dans le vide spatial, un vaisseau plus petit qu'un croiseur de bataille mais fortement armé. Jared plissa les yeux devant l'écran, « Oh oui, c'est le genre de vaisseau qui te réduit en miettes. » Zian était déjà en train d'activer les communications. Quelques secondes plus tard, une voix crépita dans les haut-parleurs nets, sèche et indéniablement peu impressionnée, la voix de Zian dit « Tu as été occupé. » Jared se pencha en avant et remarqua « Vous n'avez pas mentionné qu'elle semblerait si en colère. S'attendait-elle à ce que tu enlèves un humain ?» La transmission crépita « Qui parle ?» Jared leva les mains. « Ouais, désolé, je ne voulais pas offenser la mystérieuse dame de l'espace nommée J'ai d'ancienne prisonnière actuelle fugitif aussi je suis très charmant. » Un silence puis la voix répondit « Je vois que Saron exhala en pinçant l'arête de son nez. Capitaine Roland, nous avons besoin d'une extraction, capitaine. » Le soupir de Ron était audible à travers les communications, « Bien sûr que vous en avez besoin et j'imagine que vous avez une explication pour expliquer pourquoi vous voyagez avec un prisonnier humain évadé au lieu de terminer votre mission. » Zian hésita. Jared la regarda de près, notant la façon dont sa posture se raidissait. « J'ai pris une décision, dit-elle simplement. »« Oui, dit Roland, sèchement, tu l'as certainement fait. » Jared ne put s'empêcher de dire « Eh bien, pour la défense de Zinc, je suis très facile à kidnapper, je suis pratiquement sorti de cette prison moi-même. » Il y eut un autre long silence. Jared avait la nette impression que Roland hésitait à les réduire en cendres. Enfin, le capitaine reprit la parole, « Amarrage avec mon vaisseau, rapidement. » Zian ne perdit pas de temps pour manœuvrer le vaisseau vers l'autre vaisseau. À mesure qu'il s'approchait, Jared put mieux l'observer. Élégant, conçu pour la vitesse, avec des armes discrètement dissimulées le long de la coque, définitivement pas un vaisseau militaire officiel. Des contrebandiers. Jared devina que ce n'était pas tout à fait ça, dit Zien. Jared plissa les yeux. Des pirates, dit Zien sans répondre. Le processus d'amarrage se déroula sans accroc et bientôt l'écluse s'ouvrit avec un sifflement. Jared se leva en s'étirant et se tourna vers Zien. D'accord, alors quelles sont les caractéristiques typiques et une cicatrice courant sur un côté de son visage? Ses yeux sombres passèrent de Zien à Jared, peu impressionné. Donc, Relon a dit en croisant les bras, tu as volé un humain. Jared mit une main. Je me suis échappé de son emprise, merci beaucoup. C'était assez spectaculaire, et tu aurais été impressionné. Relon semblait peu impressionné et se tourna vers Zien. Je présume qu'il y a une explication à tout cela, acquiesça Zien. Je vais expliquer, grogna Relon. Tu choisis toujours le chemin le plus ardu, Zien. Elle a ordonné à son équipage d'évacuer la zone, en déclarant que si quelqu'un ne serait-ce que respirait dans leur direction, elle voulait que les armes soient prêtes et équipées. L'équipage s'exécuta rapidement. Ron jeta un dernier coup d'œil à Jared. Ne touchez à rien, ordonna-t-elle, et si vous agissez de manière imprudente, je vous expulserai par l'écluse. Jared sourit, indiquant que nous sommes destinés à devenir de grands amis. Zion expira en massant ses tempes. Jared la rassura d'une tape sur l'épaule, en disant « Ne paraissez pas si anxieuse, nous sommes des fugitifs à bord d'un vaisseau de contrebandiers, entourés de personnes qui souhaitent sans aucun doute me nuire. Que pourrait bien mal tourner ?» Zien murmura quelque chose dans sa langue natale. Jared était tout à fait certain que le bourdonnement des moteurs du vaisseau n'était pas un compliment. Le bruit de fond constant et régulier l'accompagnait alors qu'il s'appuyait contre le mur du petit couloir, observant Zien. Pace, ses oreilles allongées frémissant légèrement d'irritation. L'équipage de Ron ne l'avait pas emprisonné, ce qu'il percevait comme une victoire, néanmoins, ils avaient clairement indiqué qu'il était une présence indésirable. Jared remarqua en massant ses poignets, auparavant contraints, je vais me risquer à deviner que vos associés pirates, ou plutôt contrebandiers, ne sont pas contents de ma présence. Zien lui jeta un coup d'œil, répondant, ils sont inquiets. C'était un euphémisme indiquant qu'une seule erreur pourrait entraîner mon expulsion par l'écluse. Jared sourit, exprimant son enthousiasme pour les nouvelles rencontres. Zien exhala brusquement, visiblement peu impressionné, en déclarant « Je ne m'attendais pas à Relon. » Pour te saluer, tu as souri, indiquant que c'était ton plan. Amène-moi ici et attends le meilleur résultat, plutôt que de te fier au plan révisé de Zien. Jared siffla, remarquant que c'était un terme audacieux pour les événements récents. Avant que Zien ne puisse répondre, une voix métallique intervint, les appelant des humains. Jared se tourna pour observer une figure redoutable ressemblant à Zien, mais revêtue d'une armure plus imposante, dégageant l'aura évidente d'un individu probablement capable de prendre une vie à main nue. Ses yeux pâles à pupilles fendues se plissèrent alors qu'il déclarait simplement « Vous ne valez pas le risque ». Jared leva les mains, exprimant son admiration pour la franchise, qui aborde véritablement le cœur du problème, tandis que Zien s'interposa entre eux. TK Stand Down Relon a consenti à permettre sa présence. TK est resté immobile. Relon a accepté d'évaluer la situation, si elle le juge menaçant, je l'expulserai. Par l'expulser, je suppose que vous n'impliquez pas une escorte douce jusqu'à la station spatiale la plus proche. Jared demanda, montrant légèrement les dents, exprimant un sentiment qui était un mélange de mépris et d'avertissement. Jared joignit ses mains avec enthousiasme. Je veillerai à être totalement non menaçant. TK lança un dernier regard noir avant de s'engager dans le couloir. Jared expira lentement. Tes amis sont assez hospitaliers, ils sont prudents avec les étrangers, remarqua Zeren. Oui, j'ai remarqué ça, répondit Jared en secouant la tête. Quel est le plan, précisément? Tu as tout risqué pour me libérer, mais que se passe-t-il ensuite? Nous nous cachons, nous fuyons, nous trouvons une planète isolée et nous ouvrons un magasin de sandwichs, répondit Zien. Elle ne répondit pas immédiatement, au lieu de cela, elle croisa les bras et jeta un coup d'œil dans le couloir, comme pour s'assurer que personne n'écoutait. Il y a une station de recherche. Elle a déclaré, enfin, Au fin fond de l'espace inexploré, je crois qu'il renferme des réponses. Zien hésita, se demandant pourquoi il ne pouvait pas éliminer Jared. Jared cligna des yeux, répondant, « Ce n'est pas la réponse que j'avais anticipée. » Les yeux argentés de Zien rencontrèrent les siens avec une expression solennelle et impénétrable. J'étais conditionné à obéir et à percevoir les humains comme des adversaires, néanmoins, lorsque j'étais commandé, je ne pouvais pas exécuter l'ordre. Jared déglutit. Que croyez-vous que cette station va élucider? Peut-être que cela clarifiera pourquoi vous avez soudainement acquis une conscience, suggéra-t-elle, ou peut-être que cela révélera pourquoi mon peuple a été instruit de ne ressentir aucune émotion envers le vôtre. Jared se frotta le menton. Crois-tu qu'il y a plus dans ce conflit que de la simple animosité? Zien hocha la tête. Jared exprime un profond plaisir à déchiffrer les machinations galactiques tout en évitant la poursuite de deux extraterrestres distincts. Zien, extrêmement apaisant, a ignoré son sarcasme. Ron ne nous y emmènera pas sans justification, nous devons la persuader. Jared leva un sourcil, car elle a été assez réceptive à nos suggestions jusqu'à présent. Zien respira, laisse-moi faire. Jared sourit, s'exclamant qu'il devait assister à cela, quand la voix de Ron crépita dans l'interphone du vaisseau, ordonnant, Calzion, rendez-vous immédiatement dans mes quartiers. Jared grimaça, cela semblait extrêmement cordial. Zien avança dans le couloir avec détermination, et Jared le suivit, résolument conscient de s'abstenir de prononcer quoi que ce soit qui pourrait entraîner son oblitération en entrant dans les quartiers de Ron. Le capitaine était positionné derrière un bureau en métal courbé, ses yeux sombres vifs et scrutateurs. Une carte stellaire holographique scintillait au-dessus de la surface, émettant une lueur bleue dans la pièce faiblement éclairée. « Vous avez de la chance que je ne prenne pas de décision basée sur l'instinct, déclara Relon sans détour, sinon, j'aurais expulsé votre compagnon humain dans l'espace il y a des heures. » Jared leva un doigt, interrompant, « Je pense qu'il est nécessaire de mentionner que je viens d'avoir cette discussion avec Trick, donc nous pouvons probablement passer cette étape. » Relon l'ignora, dirigeant son attention vers Zien à la place. « Vous avez volé votre propre peuple, trahi votre commandement, et maintenant vous cherchez mon aide. Expliquez-moi pourquoi je devrais m'abstenir de vous dénoncer pour une récompense substantielle. » Jared fronça les sourcils. « Tu es vraiment un optimiste, n'est-ce pas? » Relon sourit en coin. « Je suis pragmatique. » Zien s'avança. « Il y a une station de recherche, notre station de recherche. Je crois qu'elle contient des informations classifiées concernant cette guerre, ses origines et les vérités cachées. » L'expression de Ron resta inchangée, et je me suis demandé pourquoi je devrais m'inquiéter. Zien n'a pas réagi, car cela suggère que notre espèce entière a été trompée. Un regard fugace d'émerveillement traversa le visage de Ron. Jared a décidé de tenter leur chance, voyant que si ce conflit est fondé sur la tromperie, il nuit au commerce, on ne peut pas s'engager dans la contrebande quand tout le monde est décédé. Ron soupira, se massant les tempes. « Je regrette déjà de t'avoir permis de parler. » Jared sourit, assurant, « Oh, croyez-moi, cela ne fait que se détériorer davantage. » Relon s'est affaissé dans son fauteuil, inhalant lentement, puis a activé plusieurs interrupteurs sur son bureau pour afficher une carte stellaire alternative. « Votre station de recherche, déclara-t-elle, en agrandissant un petit point à peine discernable. Zien hocha la tête. Les lèvres de Relon se serrèrent. « Alors nous avons un problème, conclut-elle. » Jared croisa les bras, affirmant, « Bien sûr que nous en avons un, pourquoi n'en aurions-nous pas ?» Ron indiqua la carte, mettant en évidence la zone limitée caractérisée par des patrouilles intenses, des routes de navigation classifiées et un système de défense automatisé capable de nous anéantir si nous nous approchons trop près. Jared exhala lentement, impliquant que la proposition est en effet une mauvaise idée. Relon a confirmé cette évaluation. Jared s'est approché de Zien et lui a demandé s'il souhaitait toujours y aller. « Oui, » répondit Zien sans hésitation. Jared soupira, se frottant le visage, et remarqua, « Fantastique, j'adore les plans périlleux. » Relon les observa tous les deux pendant un long moment, puis, à la grande surprise de Jared, elle éclata de rire. « Eh bien, murmura-t-elle en se levant, j'apprécie vraiment les tâches difficiles. » Jared cligna des yeux, réalisant la situation. « Attends, c'est tout. » Tu es à relon, remarqua-t-il avec un sourire de plus en plus large. Oh non, je souhaite simplement observer si tu endures. Jared grogna, se demandant pourquoi tous les membres de votre espèce prennent plaisir à sa souffrance. Zien le regarda, perplexe, et répondit. Jared exprima une profonde appréciation pour la dynamique de l'équipe. Le vaisseau traversait le vide, naviguant rapidement à travers les périphéries désertes de l'espace cartographié. L'équipage de Ron opérait dans un silence concentré, leurs actions méticuleuses alors qu'ils recalibraient la trajectoire. La station de recherche apparaissait sur la carte stellaire comme un petit point mais fortement protégé au milieu de l'obscurité profonde. Jared s'appuya contre le mur de métal glacé, observant Zien inspecter ses armes. Pour clarifier, il a déclaré, nous infiltrons une installation de recherche hautement classifiée opérée par ceux qui souhaitent m'éliminer, et elle est protégée par un système de défense automatisé programmé pour cibler tout ce qui s'approche. Zien a correctement chargé son fusil à impulsion. Jared expira, affirmant qu'il ne percevait aucune lacune dans le plan. Zien le regarda avec une pointe de sarcasme. La voix de Ron éclata dans les communications, annonçant leur arrivée imminente à la station, soulevant la question de savoir si ce pari en valait la peine. Jared se propulsa loin du mur, suivant Zien jusqu'au cockpit, où l'affichage principal indiquait leur position. Un édifice noir d'obsidienne polie suspendu dans le vide, dépourvu de fenêtres apparentes ou de quais d'amarrage, ressemble à une forteresse monolithique dissimulée dans les étendues de l'espace profond, il évoque un sentiment de mauvais choix et de remords. Jared murmura, tandis que Relon esquissait un sourire, « Vous n'avez pas tort, et si nous ne recevons pas les codes de clearance dans les 60 prochaines secondes, nous serons anéantis. » Jared s'approcha de Zien et demanda, « As-tu un plan ?» Zien était déjà en train d'interagir avec le console du vaisseau, ses doigts naviguant habilement parmi des symboles extraterrestres. « J'ai obtenu une clé d'accès d'un officier sur le vaisseau de guerre, si le cryptage reste intact, elle devrait nous permettre de contourner la barrière initiale. Si elle n'est pas valide, intervint Relon, nous créerons une explosion plutôt spectaculaire dans environ 30 secondes. » Jared hocha la tête, appréciant la positivité à bord du vaisseau spatial. L'écran clignota, indiquant un avertissement, vaisseau illégal détecté. Zien Relon l'a averti, mais Zien est resté insensible, continuant à taper alors que l'alerte réapparaissait. En initiant des mécanismes de défense, Jared devint tendu. Je suis réticent à périr avant de comprendre mon désir pour les dames extraterrestres, puis, brusquement, le message a changé pour indiquer que l'accès était autorisé. Bienvenue, commandant. Jared cligna des yeux, momentanément confus, alors que le regard de Ron se dirigeait vers Zien. Le commandant Zien était immobilisé, fixant l'écran, apparemment incapable de comprendre les événements récents. Jared fit un geste. Manus, excusez-moi pour l'interruption, mais venons-nous de passer la sécurité en raison de l'hypothèse du système selon laquelle vous êtes un employé ici? Zien finit par articuler, je n'ai jamais été commandant. Relon répondit, la station semble être en désaccord alors qu'ils traçaient leur chemin, incertain si ce développement est avantageux ou nuisible. Jared fit une grimace, peut-être pour indiquer son mécontentement, car personne ne lui répondit. Le vaisseau manœuvra vers la station, traversant sans effort le réseau indétectable des systèmes de défense sans rencontrer aucune résistance. Alors qu'il s'approchait, une trappe d'entrée s'ouvrit avec un sifflement, offrant un accueil automatique. Jared déglutit, c'était extrêmement grave. Ils entrèrent dans la station prudemment, les armes à la main. L'air était vif et glacial, résonnant avec le bourdonnement subtil de machines dissimulées. Les couloirs s'étendaient dans un silence étrange, lisse et mécanique. Inaltéré par le passage du temps, Jared tremblait, cet endroit semble excessivement stérile, comme si quelqu'un nous observait sans aucun doute. Zien resta concentré, scrutant les couloirs. Nous devons localiser la base de données principale, tous les dossiers concernant la bataille y seront stockés. L'équipe de Ron s'est dispersée pour prendre des positions de défense. T scrutait déjà chaque ombre, comme s'il défiait une attaque imminente. Ils avancèrent en ordre jusqu'à ce qu'ils arrivent à une salle de contrôle centrale, où la porte était énorme et renforcée. Zien posa sa paume contre un scanner. Une douce mélodie résonna, indiquant l'accès accordé. « Bienvenue, commandant. Jared lui lança un regard et déclara qu'elle devait fournir une explication. Zien resta silencieuse en entrant dans la pièce circulaire, ornée de consoles holographiques et illuminée par des flux de données vacillants, avec des écritures extraterrestres défilant perpétuellement. Elle s'approcha du terminal principal, ses doigts suspendus au-dessus de l'interface, lorsqu'une voix se fit entendre. La chambre résonna avec la confirmation de l'identité. « Commandant Zien, vous êtes de retour. » Jared se tendit, s'exclamant « Oh, ce n'est pas du tout troublant », tandis que l'expression de Xiron restait impassible. « Identifiez-vous. » La voix répondit de manière posée et synthétique. « Je suis l'intelligence de la station, vous permettez l'activation de cette installation. » Jared demanda à Relon si elle avait vraiment déclaré qu'elle l'avait activée, car il percevait cela comme une information significative. Ron croisa les bras, il semble que notre estimé Zien cache des secrets. Les mains jointes, Xiron déclara « Je ne suis jamais venu ici auparavant. » L'IA a répondu « Les dossiers indiquent que vous avez dirigé l'initiative de recherche. Souhaitez-vous procéder à la restauration du projet ?» L'abdomen de Jared tordu, en effet, cela semble certainement de mauvais augure. Zien fixa l'écran. « Affichez les dossiers » ordonna-t-il alors que la pièce scintillait. Des hologrammes apparurent sous forme de fichiers images contenant des rapports cryptés. Le cœur de Jared s'emballa alors qu'il parcourait le texte. Projet de reconstruction de la mémoire de la domination. Relon lâcha un juron. Jared fronça les sourcils et demanda ce que cela signifiait. Zien resta silencieux pendant un long moment avant de répondre doucement, « Cela signifie que j'étais impliqué dans quelque chose avant de me souvenir. » Le pouls de Jared s'accéléra. « Crois-tu que quelqu'un a effacé tes souvenirs ?» L'argent de Xiron avec les yeux assombris, « Je soupçonne que quelqu'un a effacé les nôtres. » Les lumières de la pièce pulsaient, semblant reconnaître la vérité. Jared expira, affirmant, « Cela s'aligne certainement. » Ron examina les dossiers, et Zien serra les poings, suggérant que la situation pourrait ne pas être telle que nous l'avions été informés. J'émis un rire creux, exprimant du mépris pour la logique de cette conclusion. La voix de l'IA les interrompit une fois de plus. « Commandant, dois-je procéder à la restauration du projet ?» Tout devint silence. Jared demanda à Zien, « Si ce conflit est fondé sur des mensonges, désirons-nous vraiment découvrir les architectes de ces tromperies ?» Le regard inébranlable de Zen resta fixé alors qu'elle avançait, sa voix résolue. « Oui, restaurer tout. » La station obéit, les murs s'animèrent de données tandis que des archives dissimulées émergeaient, révélant la réalité longtemps enfouie devant eux. Jared pressentait qu'ils désapprouveraient leur découverte alors que la station tremblait sous leurs pieds, approchant de l'aboutissement du processus de réparation. Les écrans s'illuminèrent de données qui avaient été obscurcies pendant des générations, révélant des souvenirs et des documents cachés. Communication. La vérité n'était plus simplement un murmure dissimulé dans des documents confidentiels, elle se manifestait devant eux. Jared observait Zien alors qu'elle restait immobile, ses yeux argentés scrutant les images projetées. Il ne pouvait que spéculer sur ses pensées, son existence entière, son but, son conflit façonné par des forces qu'elle n'avait jamais pleinement comprises. Jared, se frottant l'arrière du cou, demanda « Comment nous sentons-nous » Débordés ? Trahis ? Une crise existentielle à l'horizon ? Zien ne répondit pas, à la place, elle tendit la main pour toucher l'un des hologrammes lumineux. Une vidéo montrait un enregistrement de hauts responsables des factions humaines et Valérie conversant à voix basse. Jared plissa les yeux. Je trouve cette image étrange, étant donné notre animosité de longue date qui dure depuis des décennies. Relon murmura une juron, sentant que quelque chose clochait. Jared leva les mains en signe d'exaspération, se demandant pourquoi les affaires semblaient toujours impliquer une conspiration clandestine. Il déplorait le manque de simplicité, préférant un conflit direct basé sur une antipathie mutuelle plutôt qu'une trahison complexe d'anciens camarades pour une guerre motivée par le profit. L'expression de Xiron était impénétrable, mais son ton restait inébranlable. Le conflit était fabriqué. Jared soupira, déclarant que c'est, selon lui, la forme de guerre la plus néfaste. L'IA a expliqué que cette station avait été conçue pour perpétuer la tromperie, les souvenirs étaient modifiés, les dirigeants étaient substitués, et le conflit n'était jamais destiné à se conclure. Jared secoua la tête, s'exclamant que c'est un niveau de vilainie extraordinaire. Zien serra le poing, déclarant que cela se termine maintenant. Jared battit des cils. En effet, vous le présentez comme une procédure simple, il suffit d'appuyer sur un bouton pour éliminer le conflit. Zien a répondu d'un ton calme mais ferme, expliquant que cette station régule les informations diffusées aux deux factions. Si nous devions diffuser ces enregistrements et révéler la vérité, Jared intervint avec un sifflement, exprimant son scepticisme quant au potentiel de chaos. Roland croisa les bras, rétorquant que l'inaction perpétuerait la guerre, entraînant davantage de pertes. Jared expira, se frottant le visage. Tu présentes un argument persuasif, et je déteste que tu le fasses. TK murmura, procédons avant que je ne supporte d'autres discussions philosophiques sur la moralité. Jared a ri doucement. J'admire ton comportement, TK. Sans ambiguïté, Roland s'adressa à Zien, affirmant que la décision finale lui revenait. Zion, sans hésitation, déclara la fin du cycle. Elle s'avança et entra une commande. L'IA fit une pause momentanée, semblant contempler la gravité du choix, avant de sonner doucement pour confirmer le lancement de la diffusion de la vérité. La station se mit à vibrer d'énergie alors que les transmissions se répandaient dans les deux empires, effaçant des archives cachées et documentant des réunions clandestines. Tout était montré en temps réel. Jared siffla, reconnaissant l'irréversibilité de la situation. Zien se retira, regardant les écrans alors que les fondements du conflit commençaient à se fissurer. Un nouveau message est apparu, indiquant une menace imminente. Flotte détectée. Jared grogna, « Oh, allez, peut-on avoir 5 minutes avant que quelqu'un essaie de nous tuer ?» Roland devint alerte, il était temps de partir. Ils se précipitèrent vers la baie d'amarrage alors que les alarmes retentissaient. La trahison de la station ne resterait pas inaperçue, et la rétribution serait rapide. En atteignant leur vaisseau, Jared regarda Zien et demanda, « Que se passe-t-il maintenant ? Nous sommes des fugitifs, n'est-ce pas ? Peut-être que des héros légendaires sont en train de se former. » L'ennemi public numéro 1, Zien, lui offrit un rictus rare et subtil. Jared soupira dramatiquement, exprimant, « Juste une fois, j'aimerais me lancer dans une aventure qui ne se termine pas par tout le monde essayant de me tuer. » Rel le propulsa sur la rampe, l'encourageant à accélérer. Le vaisseau rugit de vie, ses moteurs s'allumant juste au moment où des vaisseaux ennemis se matérialisaient sur les scanners de la station. Ils se précipitèrent dans le vide, s'échappant dans l'hyperespace à la dernière seconde. Jared s'effondra dans un siège, en expirant, c'était extrêmement proche. Zien s'assit en face de lui, regardant les étoiles. Le conflit ne se terminera pas brusquement, mais ils sont désormais conscients de la réalité. Jared hocha la tête en signe d'accord, reconnaissant que la connaissance constitue la moitié de la lutte, tandis que Roland sourit, affirmant que l'autre moitié est la survie. Jared sourit. Un point juste. Le silence les enveloppa, mais il n'était pas oppressant, ce n'était pas le silence de la défaite, mais plutôt le silence d'un nouveau départ. Zien fixa Jared, et pour la première fois, il n'y avait pas de façade, pas de détachement glacial, seulement une détermination résolue. « Merci » déclara-t-elle. Jared sourit, supportant l'ennui d'être capturé, tandis qu'elle leva les yeux au ciel, lui rappelant l'importance du choix. Jared haussa les épaules, répondant, « À tout moment ». Alors que leur vaisseau disparaissait dans les étoiles, Jared réalisa, pour la première fois depuis longtemps, qu'il ne fuyait pas simplement, il se dirigeait vers une destination, et il n'était pas seul.
Jonas, unfortunately, did not have space magic, so he kept falling. Zira, Zira, Zira. She sighed, reached out, and grabbed him midair. The gravitational shift immediately slowed their descent, and they landed far more gracefully than Jonas had any right to. He wheezed. You know, I am really starting to get self-conscious about how effortlessly cool you are. Zira smirked. Good.
Horizon, a
Jonas
vast
groaned and
expanse
flopped onto his back. I hate everything. Zira looked around. You may hate this more. Jonas sat up, then immediately wished he hadn't. They had landed in a massive underground chamber, filled with ancient alien technology, control panels, glowing conduits, and what looked suspiciously like a command center. At the heart of the room was a monolithic structure, pulsating with energy, and inside it, something stirred. Jonas swallowed hard. So, good news or bad news? Zira didn't answer, because whatever was in that structure, it had just opened its eyes. Jonas had a firm policy about giant, glowing, probably malevolent alien structures. Stay the hell away from them. Yet here he was, sitting on the cold metallic floor of an ancient war machine, staring at a monolithic containment structure that was very clearly waking up. He exhaled. All right, quick question before I completely freak out. How screwed are we exactly? Zira, her silver eyes fixed on the pulsating structure, didn't answer immediately. That wasn't a good sign. Finally, she said, "It is. Difficult to say." Jonas threw up his hands. "Oh, well, that's just great. I love a good vague answer when my life is on the line." Zira barely glanced at him.
Her eyes
"Would you
glowing
prefer
molten gold,
completely
and
doomed?"
let out a low growl
Jonas
that
pointed at the
reverberated through
monolith,
the chamber.
which was now cracking
Fear
apart,
clawed at his
its
throat,
surface splitting
but
as something
curiosity
moved
rooted
inside.
him to the spot.
"I'd prefer
Who had stabbed
we have an
those
excellent
swords into
escape
her?
plan and a
Why
spaceship
hadn't she
waiting
removed
outside."
them?
The
And why did
structure
they call
rumbled,
to him now,
sending a pulse of
whispering
raw
promises
energy
he
through the
couldn't
chamber.
quite hear?
The walls
As he took a
shuddered,
cautious
the
step
lights
closer,
flickered,
the
and
ground
somewhere in the
trembled beneath
distance,
his feet.
an alarm
The
system
queen shifted,
blared in a
her
language
movements
Jonas didn't
deliberate yet
understand.
restrained,
He
as
turned to
though
Zira.
bound by invisible
"Okay,
chains.
no pressure,
He realized
but I
then
feel
that the
like this
swords
is a
weren't
really
merely
good time
lodged
for
in
you
her
to
flesh.
tell me what the
They
hell
were
is
holding her
inside that
captive,
thing."
pinning her to this
Zira's
icy
expression
prison.
remained unreadable.
Someone or something
"An
had
eidolon,"
left her here,
Jonas
trapped
blinked.
and waiting.
"A what
And
now?"
inexplicably,
Zira gestured
fate
to the
had brought
monolith,
him to her side.
as if that explained
The
everything.
man stood frozen,
A
his
remnant of
mind
a
racing
forgotten
with
war,
questions that
an
refused to
entity
settle.
beyond human
What could
understanding,
possibly possess
a
someone
force
to
that
leave
was
such a
sealed here
creature
because it could
imprisoned in
not
the
be
heart of a
destroyed.
glacier? Was
Jonas
she
stared at her,
dangerous,
then back at
deadly,
the cracking
or
structure,
was she merely
then back at her.
misunderstood? Another victim
"Cool,
of fear and
cool,
misunderstanding.
cool.
The sword
You
seemed
trapped
to
me
hum
in an
softly,
ancient war
their
prison with a
vibrations
cosmic
syncing
horror.
with the rhythm of his heartbeat.
This is fine."
Each pulse
I am
sent
totally
a shiver
fine.
coursing through him,
A
urging
deep,
him forward,
resonating hum
compelling
filled
him
the
to
chamber.
act.
Jonas
His
was
gloved
not fine,
fingers twitched involuntarily,
awakening the nightmare.
drawn toward the hilt of one
The crack
sword.
spread across the
He clenched
monolith's
his fist
surface,
tightly,
glowing
trying to
veins
resist
of
the
energy
pull,
splintering
but the
outward
sensation
like a
only
web
grew
of
stronger.
lightning.
It
Then with
wasn't
a
fear
final
driving
shudder,
him
the
anymore.
structure split
It was
open,
something deeper,
and something
primal,
stepped out.
as though
It wasn't a
the swords
monster in the
themselves were
traditional
calling out,
sense.
pleading
No
for
tentacles,
release.
no
He
claws,
glanced again at
no
the queen.
massive teeth.
Her golden
It was
eyes
worse.
locked onto him
It
with
was
an
humanoid,
intensity that made his
tall,
breath itch.
elegant,
There was intelligence
unnervingly
there, raw
perfect.
and ancient.
Its body
and
was
something
made of
else,
shifting
too,
liquid
pain.
metal,
Her
its
massive
face
frame quivered
featureless
slightly,
except for a
the
single
muscles
burning red
beneath her
slit
armored
where its eyes should have
exoskeleton
been.
tensing and relaxing in
Strange
slow,
circuit-like
labored
etchings
movements.
glowed across its
She
form,
wasn't fighting
shifting
him.
as if alive.
She was waiting,
It looked ancient,
taking a hesitant
it looked
step
powerful,
closer.
and
He
as it
extended
turned
his
its head
hand,
toward them,
the tips of
it
his
looked
fingers
very,
brushing
very
against
awake.
the hilt of the first
Jonas's
sword.
survival
The moment
instinct
contact
screamed
was
at him to
made,
run.
a jolt shot through his
Unfortunately,
arm,
his legs
electric and
refused to
searing,
work.
yet
The entity
strangely
took a single
exhilarating.
step forward,
Images
and the
flooded his
entire
mind.
room trembled.
Flashes of battles
Then,
fought under
in a
alien
voice that
skies,
sounded like a thousand
civilizations
layered
rising and
whispers,
falling,
it spoke.
and countless
"Who
faces
dares
screaming
wake
in
me?"
terror or triumph.
Jonas swallowed
He
hard.
staggered backward,
He was
clutching
99%
his
sure
head as
that
the visions
responding to
overwhelmed
ancient
him.
horrors
When the
was a
storm
bad
subsided,
idea, but his
he
mouth
found
had other
himself
plans.
kneeling on the icy floor,
Hi.
gasping for air.
He gave an awkward
The
wave.
queen let out a
"Big
low
fan.
rumble, almost
Really
like a
love
purr,
what you've done with
and
the
tilted
place."
her head slightly.
The entity's
For the
glowing
first
red
time,
slit
he
narrowed.
noticed the intricate
Jonas turned to
carvings
Zira.
etched into the base
"Hey,
of the
quick
sword's
strategy
hilt.
meeting.
Symbols
What do
that
we do
matched
when a
none he'd
god-tier
ever seen
death machine
before.
starts asking
They glowed
questions?"
faintly now,
Zira
responding to
remained
his
perfectly
touch,
still.
and he felt a
"Do not
strange
anger it,"
kinship with them,
Jonas
as though
snorted.
they recognized him.
"Oh yeah, sure.
Slowly,
Let me
deliberately,
just cross
he
insult
rose
the
to his
cosmic
feet and
abomination
approached her
off
once
my
more.
to-do list."
This time,
The entity
when he
tilted
grasped
its
the
head,
hilt of the first
focusing
sword,
on Zira now.
he braced himself
The air
for the
around them
surge of
buzzed with
energy.
energy,
It came
like
again,
static
but
crawling
instead
over
of
Jonas's
recoiling,
skin.
he leaned into
"A
it,
descendant
letting
of the
power
lost
flow
ones,"
through him.
it murmured.
The runes
"You
along
should
the blade
not
flared
exist."
brighter,
Jonas
casting
blinked.
long shadows across
"Wait,
the cavern walls.
What?
With a grunt
Zira's
of
jaw
effort,
clenched,
he pulled.
but she didn't speak.
At first,
The
the
entity
sword
stepped
resisted,
closer, and the
lodged
lights in the
deeply
room
the
dimmed.
queen's flesh.
The fortress
But then
itself
it began to
responded
slide
to
free
it.
with a sickening wet
Jonas
sound.
suddenly had a
The
terrible
queen
realization.
roared, a deafening
"This
cry
whole
that
place,"
shook the
he
very
said slowly,
foundations of the
turning to
glacier,
Zira,
and thrashed
"this
violently.
wasn't just a tomb.
Instinctively,
It wasn't just
he
a
threw
prison."
himself to the side,
Zira
narrowly
exhaled.
avoiding being
"It was
crushed
built
by
to
one of her
contain it,"
flailing limbs.
Jonas groaned.
When the first
"I
sword
hate
finally
when I'm
came
right.
loose, the room fell
Negotiating
eerily
with
silent.
cosmic
The
beings,
queen
bad
stilled,
idea, 10
her
out of 10
breathing
would not
heavy and
recommend.
labored, and turned
The
her gaze
Eidolon John
back to
studied
him.
Zira with
There
a
was
calculating
gratitude in her
gaze.
expression,
Then it turned
but
back to
also
Jonas.
urgency.
And you,
She shifted slightly,
human.
exposing the second
Jonas
sword
stiffened.
more clearly. This
Yep,
one seemed
that's me.
darker. Its aura
100%
heavier,
organic.
almost
Not worth
oppressive.
eating? Just
He
passing through,
hesitated.
really.
gripping the hilt
The
of
entity
first
seemed to
sword
consider
tightly
him.
as if drawing
Then in a
strength
tone
from
that
it.
was almost
Could
amused,
he
it
do
said,
this again?
"You do not
Should
belong
he?
here."
But there was
Jonas
no
let out
turning
a bitter
back
laugh.
now. Taking a
"Wow,
deep breath,
you and
he
literally
stepped
every
closer once
customs
more,
officer I've
reaching
ever
for the
met."
second sword.
The
As
Eidolon
his
didn't
fingers
react.
closed around its
Instead,
hilt,
it raised
the
one
temperature in the
metallic
cavern
hand,
plummeted sharply,
and the entire
a frost
chamber
forming
shifted.
instantly on
The
his
walls
gloves.
morphed,
The
forming
runes
a
on this
massive
blade
control
pulsed
panel,
erratically,
its
their light
interface
flickering
glowing
like
with
a dying
symbols
star.
Jonas couldn't
Pulling it
comprehend.
free would be harder.
Zira
He could
tensed.
feel it already.
"What are you
but he
doing?"
knew he had
The
no
entity
choice.
tilted its head.
The queen
"A
needed
trade."
him, and somehow
Jonas really
he
didn't like
needed
the
her
sound of
too.
that.
With every ounce of strength he
Define
possessed,
trade?
he
Freedom,
yanked the second
the
sword
Eidolon
free.
said.
The
For one of
resulting
you,
shockwave knocked
a
him off
heavy
his feet,
silence filled the
sending
chamber.
him sprawling
Jonas's
onto the
stomach
icy
dropped.
ground. Above
Zira
him,
narrowed
the
her
queen
eyes.
reared back,
"Explain."
her entire body
The
convulsing
Eidolon
as if
gestured toward the
awakening from a
interface.
long slumber.
"One of you
The
may
cavern
leave.
trembled violently.
The other
Chunks
remains."
of ice raining down from
Jonas
the ceiling.
sputtered.
Scrambling to his
"Okay,
feet,
first of
he
all,
watched in awe as
rude.
she stretched her massive
Second,
wings.
What
wings
happens
he
to the
hadn't
one
noticed
who
before,
stays?
and let out another
The Eidolon's
thunderous
glowing
roar.
slit of an eye
This
narrowed.
time, it wasn't
They
a
become
cry
part
of
of the
pain or
machine.
anger. It was a
Jonas froze.
declaration, a
Zira's
proclamation
expression
of
didn't
freedom.
change,
And
but
yet,
Jonas
as
could
she
tell
loomed
she was
over him,
calculating.
her golden
And that's
eyes
when it hit
blazing
him.
with newfound
This
vitality.
wasn't just about him.
He couldn't
It was
shake
about
the feeling
her.
that this was
She'd
only
been
the
trapped
beginning.
here for who
The
knew how
queen's
long.
gaze lingered
The
on him,
Eidolon had
her molten
recognized her
eyes piercing
species.
through the haze
It wanted
of
her to
frost and
stay.
fear.
And it was
For a
giving
fleeting
Jonas a
moment,
way out.
He thought he saw
for
something
free.
akin to recognition
Jonas
in her
swallowed hard.
expression.
Then very
Perhaps even
carefully he said,
gratitude.
"And
But
what if
then
I
her
say,
massive form shifted,
no deal?"
and the cavern seemed
The
to shrink
Eidolon
around
went
her.
still.
The air
Then in a
thickened,
voice like cracking
charged
ice
with
it
an
said,
energy that prickled
"Then you
against
both
his
die."
skin.
Jonas
he tightened his
sighed.
grip on the two
He turned to
swords,
Zira.
their weight
"So,
unfamiliar yet oddly comforting in
You
his
got a
hands.
plan?"
They
Zira
pulsed
smirked.
faintly, as
"Of
if
course."
attuned to the queen's presence.
Jonas's heart
and
lifted.
he wondered if they were
"Oh,
communicating
thank the
with her
stars.
or
What
with
is it?"
him.
She
lowered
reached
her
toward the
head,
control panel
bringing her face
and
close
punched
enough
it.
that he could see
A
the intricate
shockwave
patterns
blasted through
etched
the
into her
room as the
chitinous
system
armor.
overloaded,
They shimmered
alarms
faintly,
shrieking in
mirroring
protest.
the runes on
The
the sword's
Eidolon let out a
blades.
snarl of
A
static,
low hum
its
emanated
form
from her
glitching
throat,
violently.
resonating
Jonas's
with the
eyes
vibrations
widened.
of the weapons.
"That was your
It was
plan?
then that he realized
Violence!"
these swords
Zira
weren't
grabbed
just
his
tools
wrist.
of war.
"Run!"
They were keys.
Jonas, despite
keys to
every ounce of
understanding,
common sense,
to
listened.
unlocking something
As the
far
fortress
greater
shook
than himself.
apart, as the
The ground
Eidolon
beneath
let out a
them groaned
piercing
ominously,
electronic
the
howl,
glacier
Jonas
protesting
ran
the sudden release of
toward
energy.
the only exit that
Cracks
hadn't yet
spiderwebbed
collapsed
across
in
the
on
icy
itself.
walls,
And he really,
widening with
really
each
hoped that this
passing
time,
second. The
Zira
queen let
actually
out a
had an
guttural
escape
growl,
plan.
her body
Jonas had a
coiling
lot
like
of regrets
spring.
in life.
She was
Stealing
preparing
a
to move,
warlord's favorite
to
hover
leave this
bike,
place where she had been
regret,
imprisoned for who
taking a
knows how
loan from a
long.
crime
But
syndicate
she
without
didn't
reading the fine
attack him.
print.
Instead,
Major
she nudged
regret,
one of her massive
jumping
limbs
headfirst
toward the
into an
exit,
ancient alien
gesturing,
death
or so
fortress
it
that was
seemed,
currently
for him to
collapsing
follow.
around him.
He
Top
hesitated,
5.
torn between
Easily.
instinct and
The
reason.
entire fortress was
Following
coming
her meant
apart,
stepping into
the
the
walls
unknown,
shifting erratically,
abandoning
as
everything
if in the
familiar.
throes of a
Yet
cosmic
staying
tantrum.
behind felt
The
equally
Eidolon's
impossible.
screeching
The
howls
swords
echoed through the
vibrated
chamber,
insistently in his
distorted
hands,
and full of
their
rage.
power intertwining with
Jonas
his
didn't
resolve.
stop to look back.
Whatever destiny
valued
awaited
his
him
sanity.
beyond this cavern,
Zira,
he knew
tell me
he
you
couldn't
actually
turn away
have an
from it
exit
now.
strategy.
Taking a
He
cautious step
gasped,
forward,
dodging a
he
falling
moved
piece of
toward the
debris the
fissure
size of a
leading
star
upward.
cruiser.
The
"I
queen
have
followed,
one,"
her
she called
movements
back,
deliberate
running
but
beside him
restrained,
with
as
terrifying
though
grace.
mindful of the fragile
"It is
environment
just not a
surrounding
good
them.
one."
As they ascended,
Jonas groaned.
the cracks in the glacier
"Why do
widened
you
further,
only ever have
releasing
the bad
plumes of steam
plans?"
that obscured their
Zira
path.
barely
The
smirked.
temperature fluctuated
"You are still
wildly,
alive, are you not?"
alternating between biting
"Barely."
cold and searing
The
heat.
corridor ahead
He
of them
stumbled
rippled,
once,
like
nearly losing
reality
his footing,
itself was
but a
glitching.
tendril from the queen
Red
steadied
warning
him,
symbols
wrapping
flared to
gently
life on the
around his
walls.
waist before
The
retracting.
fortress's
It was a
ancient
gesture
systems
of
screaming in
protection,
protest.
or perhaps
Then
trust.
ahead, a
When they
doorway
finally
appeared,
emerged into
one
the
that
open
hadn't
air,
been there
the
before.
sight that greeted
Zira
them
grabbed
was
Jonas's
surreal.
wrist and
The
yanked him
glacier
toward
had
it.
begun to collapse.
"Move!" They
Great
dived
chunks of
through
ice
just as the
calving off
structure
into the
behind
abyss
them
below.
imploded,
The
a
sky
massive
above
energy
churned with dark
shockwave
clouds,
ripping through the
lightning
chamber.
illuminating
And
the horizon
suddenly,
in flashes
they
of
were
blinding
falling.
brilliance.
Jonas
The
had
wind
exactly
howled
3
louder than
seconds
ever,
to process
carrying
this
with it
before
the scent of
gravity
ozone
rudely
and something
reminded him
else,
of physics.
something
He
metallic
flailed
and alien.
midair.
The queen spread her
Why
wings fully for the
does
first
this
time. Their
keep
span
happening
dwarfing
to
even the
me?
largest predators he'd
Zira,
ever
of
encountered.
course, was
They
completely
shimmered with
calm,
an iridescent
adjusting
sheen,
her trajectory
catching the light in
mid-fall,
ways that
like some
defied
kind of
explanation.
gravity-defying
She let out a
acrobat.
triumphant roar,
Jonas hated her
the
a little
sound
for that.
echoing across
They
the barren
plummeted through an
landscape.
open shaft,
Then,
the
without
wind
warning,
roaring
she
past them,
launched herself into
and
the
then,
air,
with
her
terrifying
wings beating
speed,
powerfully
the ground
against the
rushed up
storm.
to meet them.
He watched her rise
Jonas
higher
braced
and
for
higher,
impact.
disappearing
Instead,
into the
a
tempestuous
gravity
clouds.
field activated
For a
beneath them,
moment,
slowing
he
their
thought she
fall
had
just in
abandoned
time.
him. But
They hit the
then,
ground
a
rolling,
shadow descended
tumbling into a
swiftly,
darkened control
blotting out
chamber,
the dim light.
panting and
The
gasping for
queen
breath.
landed mere feet away,
Jonas lay
her
flat on
golden
his back,
eyes locking
staring at
onto
the
his
ceiling.
once more.
I just
She
want to
lowered
take
her
a
head,
moment to
bowing
say,
slightly,
he
an
wheezed,
act of
that I
acknowledgement,
officially
or
hate
perhaps
everything about
invitation.
today.
Clutching the
Zira
swords
sat
tightly,
up, brushing
he stepped
dust from her
forward,
glowing
his
suit.
heart pounding in his
Noted.
chest.
Jonas
Whatever
groaned.
lay ahead,
You don't
he
even
knew
care.
one thing for certain.
She almost
This
smiled.
journey was far
Also
from over.
noted.
The queen's massive
final
form loomed
puzzle.
over him. Her
The
golden
room they
eyes
had
glowing
landed
with
in wasn't
intensity
just
that
any
seemed
part
to
of the
pierce through
fortress.
the storm
It
raging
was the
around them.
core.
Her wings
Unlike the
spread
crumbling
wide,
hallways above,
casting a shadow
this
that
chamber
enveloped him
still
completely.
held power.
Yet he felt no fear,
Ancient alien
only a
technology
strange
hummed
sense of
around them,
purpose.
circuits
She let
glowing
out a
in
low
intricate
rumble,
shifting
the
patterns.
sound reverberating
And at the
in his
center
chest
was a
like
final
the tolling
control
of some
panel,
ancient bell.
one that
It
pulsed with a
wasn't a
deep,
command or a
eerie
threat.
energy.
It was an invitation,
Jonas stared at it.
one he couldn't refuse
Then at
even
Zira.
if he wanted to.
Okay,
He took
he
another
said
step
slowly.
forward. His
Tell me
boots
this
crunching
isn't
against
another
the
terrible
icy
idea.
ground. The sword
Zira
in his hands
exhaled.
pulsed faintly.
It is the
their
only way to
energy
stop the
syncing with
Eidolon from
rhythm of the
escaping.
queen's breathing.
Jonas
He could feel
groaned.
their power
Cool,
coursing through him,
great.
as though
Love
they
that
were
for
alive
us.
and feeding off his
Zira
resolve.
moved toward the panel,
Each beat of her
pressing
wings
her
sent
palm
gusts of
against
wind
it.
whipping past
Symbols
them,
flashed,
carrying shards
and the
of ice
room
and fragments
responded,
of memory.
a deep
Visions of
vibration
battles
pulsing through
fought
the
under
walls.
alien skies,
Jonas watched
civilizations
warily.
consumed by fire and
So,
frost, and beings whose forms defied comprehension.
What exactly are we
The
doing?
queen lowered herself slightly,
Zira didn't look up.
angling her body so that
Sealing
one of
the
her massive
Eidolon
limbs
inside.
extended toward him.
Jonas
At
frowned.
first, he thought
Wait,
she meant for him to
wait.
climb onto her back.
Didn't
But
we
then he
already
noticed
break its
something
prison?
else. A faint
Zira's
glow
glowing
emanating from
silver
beneath
eyes
her armored
flickered.
plates,
Yes.
pulsing in time with the
So
sword's
now we
vibrations.
must create a new
Whatever
one.
bond had formed between
Jonas
them
felt
was
a
growing
cold chill
stronger,
creep up his
weaving
spine.
threads of connection
Oh,
neither
that
fully
sounds
understood
bad.
nor controlled.
That sounds like
Taking a
personal
deep
sacrifice
breath,
territory.
He reached out cautiously,
Zira
placing a
hesitated,
gloved hand
and that's
on her
when
limb.
Jonas knew.
The moment his fingers
You're not
made
planning to
contact,
leave, are you?
a surge of
He
warmth
said,
shot through
his
him,
voice quieter.
chasing away the biting
Zira
cold.
didn't answer right away.
Images flooded his
Then
mind
finally
again,
she said,
this time
someone
clearer,
must remain
more
to
vivid.
complete the
He
sequence.
saw himself standing
Jonas
amidst
crossed
ruins
his arms.
older than humanity
Yeah,
itself,
not happening.
wielding the two
Zira
swords
gave him a
against
patient
enemies,
but
both
infuriatingly
monstrous and
stubborn
mechanical.
look.
He saw the
Jonas,
queen beside him,
nope.
her presence
Jonas jabbed a
unwavering,
finger
her
at her.
strength unmatched.
We've known each other,
And
what,
he
like
saw
12 hours?
something else.
And in that time,
A
you've
void,
saved me from
vast and
monsters,
unending,
insulted my
swallowing
intelligence,
stars whole.
thrown me off
Within
a
it,
ledge,
a single
and
point
proven
of
that
light
you are
flickered,
way cooler than me
fragile
in
but
every possible
persistent.
way.
The vision faded
She
as
blinked.
quickly as it had come,
Is there a point?
leaving him disoriented
Jonas
and
exhaled.
gasping for air.
Yeah, we're
The
not doing the
queen let out another
self-sacrifice
low
thing.
growl, nudging him
Zira's
gently
expression
with her limb.
softened, just
He
for a
steadied
second.
himself,
There is
gripping
no
the
other.
swords tightly once
Sure there
more.
is.
Whatever lay
Jonas
ahead,
clapped his hands
he
together.
realized, would
We cheat.
demand everything he had,
Zira raised
and
an
perhaps
eyebrow.
more.
Cheat?
With a final glance
Jonas
at the
grinned.
collapsing glacier
Look,
behind
I'm
him,
not an
he
ancient
climbed
alien
onto her
engineer,
back.
but I
Her
am
armor
really
was
good at one
surprisingly
thing.
smooth beneath
He
his
turned to the
touch,
control panel,
warm despite
breaking
the freezing
things.
winds howling around them.
Zira blinked.
As soon as he
Then
settled into
slowly,
position,
her lips
she
curved
rose
into a
into the
smirk.
air with a powerful
I
thrust
see.
of her wings.
Breaking
world
the
fell away below
unbreakable.
them, swallowed
The
by
Eidolon's
clouds
howls
and
grew
chaos.
louder, the
Lightning
walls
streaked
shaking
across
violently.
The sky,
Jonas
illuminating
worked
jagged
fast,
peaks and
hands
endless
flying
expanses
across
of
the
ice.
alien
The
interface,
storm raged on,
overriding
but
systems
within
he
its
didn't
fury,
understand with
there was
sheer
a strange
reckless
harmony,
determination.
a symphony of
Zira
destruction
joined
and
him,
renewal.
her fingers
As
moving
they
with
ascended
precision,
higher, the air
adapting
grew
to his
thinner,
improvisation
colder,
like they had been
almost
teammates for
unbearable.
years.
Yet the
Jonas
swords
grinned.
radiated heat,
Hey, look at us.
shielding him
We're
from the
hacking
worst
an
of it.
ancient fortress
Their
together.
runes flared brightly now,
Zira rolled her
casting
eyes.
eerie shadows
You are
across the
pressing
queen's
random
wings.
symbols.
He clung to
Yeah,
her
but it's
armor,
working.
his knuckles white
The
with
entire
effort,
chamber lit
as
up.
they broke through
The Eidolon
uppermost
let out
layer
a
of
final
clouds.
distorted screech
What awaited
as the
them
system
above
locked
was
down
unlike
around it,
anything he'd
trapping
ever
it
seen.
inside the
The
fortress
sky
once
here was
again.
not blue, but
A
swirling
final
tapestry
pulse of
colors,
energy blasted
violet,
through the room,
crimson,
and
gold,
then
all shifting
silence.
and blending
The
seamlessly.
fortress
Strange shapes
still.
moved within the haze,
Jonas
too
staggered
fast
back,
to discern
panting.
clearly.
Did
They
we
weren't
just
birds or machines, but
win?
something entirely otherworldly.
Zira studied the
Their forms
console.
fluid and
Then finally she
ever-changing.
nodded.
The atmosphere
The
crackled with
Eidolon is
energy,
sealed.
each breath feeling
Jonas let
electric,
out a relieved
charged
laugh.
with latent potential.
Oh, thank the
The queen
stars.
let out a piercing
I was really
cry,
hoping to
her
live
voice
long enough
cutting
to
through
eat
the
one more
cacophony
meal.
of the storm. In
Aftermath,
response,
the
shapes
duo
darted
stumbled out of the
closer,
ruins,
encircling
into the
them in a
dim
chaotic
alien
dance.
landscape
They
beyond.
didn't attack,
The
though.
fortress was
Instead,
quiet now.
they seemed
No
curious,
shifting walls,
drawn
no
to the sword's
monsters.
glow and the
Just
queen's immense presence.
Peace.
One of the creatures,
Jonas glanced at
a
Zira.
serpentine being with
So,
translucent
now
scales
what?
and multiple sets
She
of
tilted
luminous
her head.
eyes,
I do
approached
not know.
cautiously,
Jonas
hovering
grinned.
just out of reach.
Well, I do
Its
happen to
gaze
have a
lingered on
ship.
him, studying
Zero
him
raised an
intently
eyebrow.
before retreating
You
back
crashed
into the
it.
swarm.
Jonas shrugged.
Where are we?
Minor
He
details.
whispered aloud,
A beat
though
of
he
silence.
knew there would be no
Then
answer.
Zero
The
smirked.
question hung in the air,
Jonas blinked.
unanswered yet
Oh,
somehow
stars, was that
irrelevant.
an actual
This
smile?
place existed beyond
Zero
human
rolled her eyes
understanding,
and walked ahead.
a realm where
Come,
logic
Jonas,
bent and
let's get
reality
off this
fractured.
rock.
The queen
Jonas
banked
laughed,
sharply,
jogging
her
after her.
wings slicing through
You
the
know,
kaleidoscopic
I think this
sky
is
with
the start
effortless
of a
grace.
beautifully reckless
Below them
friendship.
stretched a landscape that
And for
defied
once, he
description.
wasn't wrong.
An endless expanse of
The
floating
auction
islands
house
suspended
smelled
in
of
midair,
oil,
connected
sweat,
by bridges of
and the
light
sharp
and
sting
shadow.
of
Towering
desperation.
spires jutted upward
The air
from some
hung
of the
thick
larger land
with the scent
masses,
of machinery,
their surfaces etched
and
with symbols
bodies
similar
pressed
to those
too
on the
close.
swords.
A mix
Rivers
of
of liquid
species
starlight
all
flowed
gathered
between
under
the
the
islands,
same flickering
cascading
neon
into
lights
abyssal chasms
to buy
that
and
glowed
sell
faintly with an inner
lives.
luminescence.
Somewhere,
She descended
the
toward one
rhythmic
of the larger
clank of a
islands,
faulty
her
ventilation
movements
system
deliberate
banged
and
against the
precise.
metal walls
As they drew
like
nearer,
a hammer
he noticed
striking an
structures
anvil,
scattered across its surface,
keeping time with the
buildings
auctioneer's
unlike any
voice
he'd ever seen,
as he barked
their
out
architecture
numbers.
both alien and
Behind the
hauntingly
energy
familiar.
barriers,
Some
the
resembled
merchandise
cathedrals,
stood in
their
silence.
spires reaching skyward,
Some of
while
them had
others
already
looked like
given up,
organic growths,
eyes fixed
twisting
on
and
nothing,
curling as if alive.
waiting for the highest
Between
bidder
these
to decide
structures
their
stood
fate.
statues,
Others
humanoid
tried to
figures
look
carved from
valuable,
obsidian and
flexing
marble,
their muscles,
their faces
standing
obscured by
tall,
intricate masks.
blinking their many
The queen
eyes
landed
enticingly,
softly on the edge
anything
of the island,
to prove they were
folding her
worth the
wings
credits.
neatly against her sides.
And then
She turned her
there
head
was
toward
her.
him, her golden
She sat
eyes
in the back,
gleaming with anticipation,
shackled ankles crossed,
or perhaps warning.
wrists resting
Whatever
loosely in her
awaited
lap,
them here,
chin
it was clear
tilted
she
slightly
intended
downward,
for him to face
but
it
not quite
alongside her.
bowed.
Sliding off
A
her
collar
back,
ringed
he
her
planted
throat,
his feet firmly
humming
on the ground,
faintly with the
which
same
shimmered
power
faintly
that pulsed
beneath his
through her
weight.
cuffs.
The swords
A reminder
vibrated
that
insistently
she was
in
an
his
asset,
hands, their
not a
energy
person.
resonating with the environment
She
around
had
them.
learned not
He
to
took
care.
a cautious step forward,
It made things
scanning
easier.
the horizon for signs
The
of
traders
movement.
who had dragged
The
her
air
across
was
the
eerily
stars
silent now,
had long since
save for the
given up
soft
trying
hum
to
of the
fetch a
swords
high
and the
price.
distant rush of starlit
They
rivers.
sneered whenever
A
she
sudden
failed
shift
to
in the
perform,
atmosphere made him
muttered
pause.
under their breath
The colors
that
of
she
the
was
sky
worthless,
darkened,
a
bleeding into
mistake,
shades of
a
indigo
burden,
and black.
too
Shadows
fragile for the
lengthened
mind,
unnaturally,
too
stretching
strange for the
across the
pleasure
ground like
markets,
grasping
too
fingers.
proud to
From the
beg.
nearest structure emerged
No
a
one
figure,
had
a
use for
humanoid
her.
silhouette cloaked in
She
tattered
was sold
robes that
and
seemed woven
returned,
from darkness
passed
itself.
from one owner
Its
to
face was
another
hidden
like a
beneath
broken
mask
tool
identical to
nobody
those adorning
wanted
the
to
statues.
fix.
Its
And
edges
tonight,
glowing faintly
it
with an
seemed the
ominous red
cycle
light.
would continue.
The figure raised an arm,
Next up,
pointing
we have
directly at him.
the
Behind
auctioneer
it, more
hesitated,
shapes began
clearly
to emerge from the
unimpressed.
shadows.
He
their
squinted at
forms
his screen,
indistinct but
then back at her,
undeniably hostile.
as if searching
the queen
for something,
let out a low growl,
anything,
positioning
redeemable.
herself protectively between
sighed.
him and the advancing horde.
Lot number
Her wings
9043.
unfurled slightly,
This
ready to
one's,
strike or shield
well,
as needed.
you can see for
He
yourself,
tightened his grip on the swords,
a low
their
chuckle
warmth
spread through
anchoring
the
him
crowd.
amidst the encroaching
The energy
dread.
barrier around
Whatever
her
battle
flickered
awaited them
and
here,
dropped.
he knew it would
The
test
traders
not only
shoved
his
her
strength
forward,
but his very soul.
and she took an unsteady
And yet,
step
as
onto
he
the
stood there
auction
facing the
platform.
unknown, he felt
A
no
hush
regret,
settled over the
only
crowd,
determination.
not out of
For
awe
better
or
or
interest,
worse,
but a
this
collective
journey had
sense
become
of
his
vague
destiny.
disappointment.
The figure in the tattered
She's
robe stepped forward.
small,
Its
someone
movements
muttered.
unervingly fluid,
She's not
as
small,
though it glided
another
rather than
voice
walked.
corrected.
The Galactic
The
Council's
massive light
bureaucracy,
seemed to pulse
like
with
most
Look at that
forms of
bone
institutionalized
structure. The red
paranoia,
glow
like she'd
evolved
snapped
from
with a strong
perfectly
breeze.
reasonable beginnings
Behind
into
it,
something
the shadowy
magnificent.
And the
forms spread
color.
out, their
What
forms
even
shifting
is
and
that?
writhing like smoke given
Her
life.
skin was a
They
pale
didn't speak
violet,
or make any sound,
tinged with a
but
faint
their
silver
presence
Drake
sheen
Ben had
beneath
spent
the
enough time
overhead lights.
scraping by on the edge of the
Her eyes,
galaxy to know that
large and
taking in
dark,
strays was a
reflected
bad
the
idea.
neon above in a
The
way
Strays
that
came
made
in
them
trouble,
seem too deep,
and trouble had a
too
way of
vast,
multiplying
staring
faster than
into
a
the edge of a
malfunctioning
black
replicator.
hole.
Her wings
And yet there he
Somewhere,
was,
a buyer
cast
cleared his
staring at the
throat.
half-frozen alien
Does it
girl
talk?
curled up near the
The
steaming
auctioneer
exhaust
glanced at
vents.
the traders. One of them
charged by
shrugged.
the opposing forces.
She's got a
the
mouth.
queen's radiant power and the
The crowd
oppressive void
chuckled
exuded
again.
by the masked figure
She
and its
exhaled
followers. He
slowly,
tightened his grip
controlling
on the
the
swords,
urge to
their
roll her
vibrations
eyes.
growing erratic,
It was
almost
always
frantic.
the same.
It was as
The
though they
sneers,
recognized the
the
enemy before
half-hearted
them,
bids,
reacting
the disinterest.
instinctively to the threat.
Soon,
The runes
someone
etched
would
into
offer
their
a
blades
handful of
flared
credit.
brightly,
Someone
illuminating
else
the
would
immediate
scoff,
area with an
and then
otherworldly
she'd
light.
be hauled off
He
to
could
another
feel their
station,
energy coursing
another
through him,
planet,
bolstering
be
his
another
resolve
failed
even as doubt
investment.
clawed at
The
the edges
icy
of his
surface
mind.
And
of
then
Europa
who
shimmered
spoke?
faintly
Or what
under the
were
dim
I'll
light
take
of
her.
Jupiter.
And
The
why
voice
did they
cut
seem
through
so
the murmurs
intent
like
on
a blade,
stopping him?
across the
sharp
The
horizon.
masked
and
figure
careless.
stopped
The
just a
Europa
few
It
paces
didn't
pacers
away,
boom with authority.
tilting
A
its head
small
slightly
didn't
as if
slither
sucking
with greed.
built into the
It was
without
just
warning, crust. It raised
buzzed
both
with
arms,
activity
and the
as
ground
if
beneath
buying
them
a
began to
sentient
tremble
being
violently
was no different from
uncover
picking up a
across the
snack at a
shimmering surface of
convenience
the
stall.
island, glowing
All
faintly
heads
with the same
turned.
ominous red light
She
as
turned
the figure's
too,
mask.
expecting
From the
to see
fissures
another
emerged more
arrogant
creatures,
warlord,
twisted
another
amalgamations of
alien
flesh and
female
bone,
into
their
pools,
eyes
but
burning
she
with
does another
something
monster
strange. They moved
hiding
with
behind
mechanical
Liam hadn't
precision,
expected much
surrounding
from
them
the
in a
evening.
tightening
She
circle.
saw a human,
Stay
some late.
close,
He didn't
muttered under
belong
his
here.
breath. Though whether
Dressed
he
in
was
a
speaking to
patched-up
himself or
jacket
the
and
queen,
scuffed boots,
he wasn't sure.
he looked more like
She
a dock
responded with a
worker
low
than a
rumble.
buyer.
Her
I was
massive
chained
His
beside
dark
an
hair
alien
was a
warrior.
mess,
Now she says
sticking
we're
out in
made.
directions
Welcome
that
to the
defied
world of
physics.
science fiction.
Two
Comment
stubble on
below
his
where
jaw
in the
was
world
just
you are
uneven
watching
enough
from
to
today.
suggest he
And if
either
you like
couldn't
this
grow a
story,
proper
don't
beard
forget to
or
subscribe.
just didn't care enough to try.
Its claws
He had an
gleaming
easy
wickedly in the
stance.
dim light.
One
The
hand in
queen
his
reacted
pocket,
instantly,
the other
swiping one
lazily
of her
scratching the
powerful
back of
limbs
his
and
head,
sending the creature
like he
crashing
just
into the
wandered in
nearest
by
structure.
accident.
Stone shattered
auctioneer
upon
blinked.
impact, sending
You
shards flying in
want
all
this one?
directions.
I was chained beside
You
an
would
alien
not.
warrior.
She dispatched.
Now she
Sure.
says we're
Two
mates.
more
A
seemed
murmur
Welcome to the
spread through
world
the
of
crowd.
science
The horde
fiction.
was
Some
Comment
stifled
below
laugh.
where in the
Forth from the
world you are
cracks
Sir,
watching
water
from
to
the
today.
auctioneer said
And if you
carefully,
like this
realizing
as
story,
if addressing
don't
a
forget to
particularly
subscribe.
dim-witted
Jackson
child.
Kane's head
This
pounded
one
like
isn't
someone had taken a
exactly
plasma wrench to his
premium
skull,
stock.
and the taste of iron
Oh,
lingered in his
yeah.
mouth as he
The
slowly
human
regained
squinted up at her.
consciousness. His
She's
arms were
breathing,
stiff,
isn't
his
she?
shoulders screaming in
Well,
protest
yes.
as he shifted, the cold
got a
bite of
brain?
metal cutting into
The
his
auctioneer
wrist.
hesitated.
Shackles,
Technically,
thick, heavy, and bolted
Cool.
to the damp
How
stone
much?
wall behind him.
The traders
The
exchanged
air was
glances.
thick with the
Someone
scent of
snorted.
sweat, rust,
You
and something
serious?
darker.
You're
Blood,
actually
maybe.
offering credits
His
for that?
vision swam as he blinked against the dim glow of
Listen,
flickering plasma
called her
torches
worthless.
lining the walls.
So I'm
It
thinking,
took him a few
how
moments to
much for
realize
something
where he
worth
was,
nothing?
but when he did, his
silence.
gut twisted.
Then
This wasn't just any cell.
The
It was a
auctioneer
holding
exhaled
pit,
through his
underground,
nose, tapping
off
at
the
his
grid,
holoscreen.
a place where people
Look,
weren't meant to leave alive.
You want her that badly?
He flexed his
Fine.
fingers, testing his
300
range of
credits.
motion. His
The
body
human
sluggish
raised
from
a brow.
whatever sedative they used to
300?
drag him in here. He barely remembered the ambush.
The auctioneer
One minute
groaned.
he was making an easy cargo
Fine.
run through the border cells.
200.
The next,
The
his
human
ship was
grinned.
ripped out of hyperspace by a
150.
gravity snare. Pirates.
Another trader
He had
sighed.
assumed at first,
Just
but
take her
pirates
already.
usually had the courtesy
The
of
gavel
robbing you
slammed
before
down.
tossing you
She
into a
blinked,
death hole.
her mind
The
struggling to
Gorak
catch up.
warlords didn't bother
was
with
it?
petty theft.
He had bought her?
They were
For
slavers,
150
pit masters,
credits.
and entertainment
The
brokers.
collar deactivated.
It summoned a
The
swirling
shackles
vortex
unlocked.
of shadows directly
The traders
above them.
shoved her
The darkness
forward.
descended
Her
rapidly,
last
enveloping
unceremonious
everything in
sail.
its path.
The human
Visibility
caught her
dropped to
before
near
she
zero,
could stumble.
and the cacophony of
His grip
battle
was
faded
firm,
into an
but not
eerie
forceful.
silence.
His
All he
fingers
could hear
warm
was the
against her
steady
wrist.
thrum of the swords in his
For a moment,
hands and the
she
rhythmic
simply
beating
stared
of
at
his
him.
own heart.
And then,
Instinctively,
finally,
he reached
found
out
her
with one
voice.
hand, finding
Why?
the queen's armored
The
side.
human tilted his head.
Her warmth anchored
What?
him amidst the
You wanted to
suffocating
stay?
void, grounding
Number,
him when all
but-
else threatened to
She
overwhelm.
frowned.
We
You
can't
don't even
stay
know what
here,"
I am.
he whispered hoarsely,
He grinned.
unsure
I
if she
know
could
what you
understand him.
aren't.
But she
Her eyes
responded
narrowed.
immediately,
And
nudging
what's
him
that?
gently toward what he assumed
Worthless.
was the direction of
She
the
opened her
vortex's
mouth,
edge.
then closed
They
it again.
moved cautiously,
That
the
was
sword's
definitely
light barely
new.
piercing the oppressive
He let go
gloom.
of her wrist
Every
and
step felt
gestured toward the
heavier than the
exit.
last, as though
Come
the
on.
shadows themselves sought
You look
to
like
pull
you
them
could
back.
use a drink.
He slashed blindly
don't
at the
drink.
darkness, hoping to
Great.
clear a path.
More for
but
me.
the void simply swallowed
She
the energy,
hesitated,
leaving
but
them
there was
trapped
no
within its
collar
grasp.
around her throat,
Suddenly,
no
the
chains
queen
on
let
her
out
wrists.
a deafening roar,
So,
her voice
she
cutting through
followed
the
him.
silence like a blade.
And for the first
The
time
sound
in a long
reverberated through the
time,
vortex,
she walked
causing the
away
shadows
on
to
her
ripple
own.
and distort.
The
Seizing
spaceport
the
was alive
opportunity,
with
she
movement,
surged
a
forward,
chaotic
dragging
swirl
him
of
along
neon
with her.
lights and
The force
voices
of her
layered
movement
over the
propelled them out of the
ever-present hum
vortex and
of
into open
distant
space
starship
once more.
engines.
They landed hard on the
Vendors
shimmering
shouted
ground,
over one another,
the impact knocking
selling
the wind from
everything
his lungs.
from steaming bowls
Gasping
of
for air,
questionable
he
stew
rolled onto his back,
to black
staring
market
up at the
cybernetic
kaleidoscopic
implants
sky
that
now
still
marred
had
by
blood
streaks
on
of
them.
black. The
The
horde
air
had
was
regrouped,
thick with the
their
sense
numbers
of
undiminished,
fuel,
but there was
metal,
something different about
and
them
something
now.
that smelled
They hesitated,
suspiciously
their
like
attention
burnt
drawn
rubber mixed
elsewhere.
with despair.
Following their gaze,
She
he saw
trailed
the
behind
masked
the
figure
human,
standing atop one of the
unsure if
obsidian
she was
statues,
walking freely
its arms
or
raised
simply
high.
following
The red
because
glow
she
of its
had nothing
mask
else
pulsed
to do.
wildly,
He
syncing with the
hadn't
rhythm of the
shackled her,
swords in his hands.
hadn't given her
It
orders,
was then that he realized
hadn't even told
the
her
figure
his
wasn't
name.
merely commanding the horde.
He simply
it was
walked
drawing
ahead,
power from them,
hands stuffed
channeling their
into his
collective
jacket
energy into
pockets,
some greater
weaving
purpose.
through the
And
crowd
whatever
with a
that
casual
purpose was,
ease that
it
suggested
involved
he
him.
was either
The
very
queen let
comfortable
out
in
another
places like
roar,
this
snapping him
or
out
too
of his
dumb
thoughts.
to realize
She
how
positioned herself
easily he
between
could be
him and the
robbed.
figure,
She was
her
still
body
trying to
tense
figure him
and
out.
ready to strike. But
So,
before Before either of
she
them
said
could
at
act,
last,
the
breaking
masked
the
figure
silence
lowered
between
its
them.
arms, pointing
What now?
directly at him. A
He
beam
glanced
of
over his
crimson
shoulder.
light shot forth,
What do you
striking
mean?
the ground mere inches
She
from where he
gestured
stood.
at herself.
The impact
You
sent
bought
shock
me.
waves rippling
That
outward,
means I belong to
forcing him
you.
to stumble backward.
The human stopped
Desperation
mid-step,
surged within
turned to
him,
face her,
fueling
and
his
blinked.
resolve. Clutching
Okay,
the swords
see?
tightly,
That's
he
not how
charged
I look
forward,
at it.
ignoring
She
the
crossed her
fatigue
arms.
weighing down his
That's
limbs.
how the universe
The
looks
horde
at it.
closed in around him,
Well,
but he cut through
the
them with
universe
renewed
also
vigor.
thinks paying
Each
70
swing of the
credits for
swords
a cup
carving
of space
paths of
coffee is
destruction.
reasonable,
The
so
queen followed
let's not
closely
trust its
behind.
judgment.
Her presence a
He
constant
started walking
reminder that
again,
he wasn't alone.
jerking his head
As
for
he
her to
neared the
follow.
statue, the masked
You don't
figure
belong
leapt
to me?
down, landing
You're just
gracefully before him.
With me now.
Up close, Its
With
mask
you,
seemed even more
she echoed.
menacing, the
He
red
shrugged.
glow searing into
Sure.
his vision.
She
He
frowned.
raised a hand,
That doesn't
and
make
he braced
sense.
himself for
He
another
grinned.
attack.
Yeah,
But instead of
I
striking,
get that a lot.
it spoke.
She sighed and
voice
quickened
was
her
not
pace
human,
to keep up.
A distorted blend
So,
of whispers
if I'm not
and
your
echoes
property,
that reverberated
what
in
am
his
I?
skull. You
Dunno,
carry the keys,
he admitted.
it intoned,
What do you want to be?
gesturing toward the swords.
That question
But
should
do
have
you
been
truly
easy to answer.
understand what they unlocked?
It should have been obvious,
He froze,
automatic.
uncertainty
Instead,
creeping into his
she
mind.
found herself
What
hesitating.
did it mean?
For so
Were the
long
swords
she had
truly
only
keys,
existed as a
as the
thing,
figure claimed?
a number,
And if so,
a mistake
what door
someone
awaited
paid
them
too
beyond
much
this
for.
battlefield?
Now,
Before he could
he was
respond,
asking her
the
what she
queen
wanted to
intervened,
be.
slamming one of her
Before
massive
she could
limbs
think
into
of a
the figure and
response,
sending it
he came to
sprawling.
a stop in
The
front
horde
of a
surged
ship.
forward again.
Calling it
Their
a ship
attacks fiercer
might
than
have been
ever.
generous.
Exhaustion
It
clawed
was
at him,
more a collection
threatening
of
to drag him
stubbornly
under,
connected
but
metal
he
plates
refused
held
to
together
yield.
by duct
Not
tape,
yet.
wishful
Not
thinking,
while the truth
and a
remained just
disregard
out
for
of
the
reach.
laws of physics.
With a final cry of
The hull
defiance,
was rusted,
he drove the
its
swords
paint
into the
long
ground,
since peeled
unleashing
away,
a burst of energy
and a
that
series of
illuminated the
mismatched
entire
parts
island.
suggested
The
that
horde
at least
faltered,
6
their
different
forms dissolving
manufacturers
into
had contributed,
nothingness. The masked
unintentionally,
figure staggered,
to its current
its mask
state.
flickering erratically
She stared
before
at it.
shattering entirely.
This is a
For a
joke.
moment,
Hey,
silence reigned.
don't judge.
Then
She's
the
sensitive.
ground beneath them began to
The
quake
human
once
stepped
more,
forward
and the sky
patted
above
the hull.
fractured like glass.
A panel
Whatever
immediately
had been
fell off
unleashed,
and clattered
it
to
was
the
far
ground.
from over.
There was a
The
long
fractured
silence.
sky above them
Then
split
he
open,
cleared his throat.
revealing a churning void
does
that
that
pulsed with an
sometimes.
ominous light.
She
The
arched
queen
an
let
eyebrow.
out a low growl,
Explode?
her body trembling
No,
as if
just
sensing the gravity of what was to
sheds.
come.
She
He
rubbed
pulled
her
the
temples.
swords from the ground,
What
their
is this
glow
wreck
dimming
called?
slightly but still steady
The
in
rust
his
bucket.
hands. We've
Of
done
course
something,
it is. He
he
smirked.
muttered, more to
She's got
himself than to
character.
her. But what?
She's got a death
The
wish.
masked figure,
He
now
waved her toward
unmasked
the
and
ramp.
revealed as a
Come
shadowy
on,
wisp,
you'll love her.
floated upward toward the rift.
She wasn't so
It turned
sure,
back briefly,
but she followed
its
him
form
anyway.
flickering like a dying
The inside
flame.
of the ship was
"You have
only
only
slightly
begun,"
better than the
It
outside.
whispered, its
The
voice
cockpit
carrying
was
both
cluttered with
warning and
half-dismantled
inevitability.
consoles
Then
and a
it
chair held
vanished
together
into
by
the
zip
void.
ties and
The quaking
optimism.
grew violent.
The
cracks
walls were
spreading across
scrawled
the
with
island
notes,
like veins.
some
The
technical,
queen nudged him
some just
urgently,
random
gesturing
thoughts.
toward her back.
Do
There
not
was no
press
time
the
to
red
hesitate.
button.
He climbed
Figure out if
aboard,
gravity
gripping
stabilizer
the
is
swords
haunted.
tightly as she
Who
launched
keeps
herself
stealing
into
my
the air.
socks?
Below, the
And the ship
floating islands
had an
began to
AI.
collapse, consumed
Sort
by
of.
the expanding
A
rift.
voice crackled
The
through the
kaleidoscopic
speakers as they
colors
stepped
bled away,
inside.
replaced by an
Welcome
endless
back,
expanse
Captain
of
Rick.
darkness.
You have
Lightning arced
14
through the
overdue
void,
payments,
illuminating
a warranty
glimpses
that
of
expired
colossal
6
shapes
years
moving
ago,
just beyond
and a
sight.
cargo hold
As
full
they
of
ascended
regrets.
higher, the
The
queen's
human,
wings beat
Rick,
furiously
apparently,
against the pole
rolled
of
his
the
eyes.
abyss. Her golden
Yeah,
eyes locked
I
onto
missed
his,
you too, Bite.
filled with
The
determination
AI paused.
and perhaps
Then,
fear.
with genuine
Whatever
enthusiasm,
awaited them next,
"Oh,
they would
you
face
brought
it
a
together.
guest? Is
The
she here
swords
to kill
pulsed
you?
faintly,
Or did you
their
finally
energy
hire
syncing with the
someone who
rhythm of
knows
their
what they're
flight.
doing?"
He glanced down
The
at
alien
them,
girl folded
realizing
her
for
arms.
the first time how
"I
much
haven't
they had
decided
changed
yet.
him. They weren't
I
just
like her."
weapons.
Rick
They were
sighed.
burdens, responsibilities he hadn't
Meet
asked
soul.
for but couldn't
She
abandon.
blinked.
Ahead,
Soul?
the void stretched
He shrugged.
endlessly, swallowing
Felt right.
stars and galaxies whole.
She opened her mouth
Yet
to
within
argue,
its
but
depths,
stopped.
He saw
She'd
something,
never had a name
a
before.
faint glimmer of hope.
Not one that wasn't a
single
number
point of
or an
light,
insult.
fragile but
Did
persistent,
she like it?
calling to him.
She wasn't sure,
The queen roared,
but she didn't
angling
hate
her
it.
body toward the light.
Fine, she
For
muttered.
a moment, everything
So,
seemed possible.
Bite let out a
Then,
suspiciously
without warning,
human-sounding
the rift
whistle.
surged, pulling them
Ooh,
downward
she's got
with
attitude.
unstoppable force.
This'll be fun.
Hold on,
Rick
he
clapped
shouted,
his hands
though
together.
he wasn't sure who
All
he
right,
was speaking to.
let's get you settled.
Himself,
We've got,
the queen, or
he
the
frowned.
universe itself.
well, there's
And as they
technically a
plummeted into
spare
the
room,
unknown,
but
the
it's full
swords
of old
flared
ship
one final
parts
time,
and socks.
bathing them in
Not
radiant
sure
light.
why. Bite chimed in. It's because you refuse to do laundry. Shut up, Bite. Sewell pinched the bridge of her nose. I'm starting to think getting sold for 150 credits wasn't the worst thing that happened to me today. Rick grinned. See? You're adjusting already. The first night on the rust bucket was strange. For years she had slept in cells, storage crates, the backs of transport ships. Every place had been the same, cold, unfamiliar, temporary. But here, there was warmth. There was the hum of the engines, the occasional sarcastic AI remark, and Rick snoring from the cockpit because he had forgotten to move to his own bed. She lay on the cot he had set up for her, staring at the ceiling. She was free. That should have made her feel something. And yet, all she felt was confusion. Rick was a mystery. The ship was a mess. The AI was a menace. And yet, for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like nothing. The rust bucket groaned like a dying beast as it entered hyperspace, its patched-together drive rattling with a noise that sounded suspiciously like someone shaking a can of nails. Sewell sat in the co-pilot's seat, arms crossed, watching as Rick leaned back, boots propped on the dashboard, completely at ease with the fact that his ship was one engine failure away from becoming space debris. "This is the worst vessel I have ever been inside," she muttered. Rick didn't even look up. "You get used to her." "I don't want to get used to her. I want to survive." Bite, the ship's AI, crackled to life over the speakers. "Statistically speaking, your odds of survival are roughly 42%. Sewell frowned. "That's not great." Bite's tone was cheerful. "It's up from last week." Rick smirked. "See? Progress," Saul exhaled, resisting the urge to rub her temples. "So, where exactly are we going?" "Kovath Station," Rick said. She frowned. That name stirred something in her memory. Kovath was an old trade hub, mostly scavengers, mercenaries, and the kind of people who carried at least 3 knives and a grudge. Rick must have noticed her hesitation because he tilted his head. "You know it?" "I know it's a terrible idea." "Well, that's where we're headed." He stretched, cracking his knuckles. "We need a new drive coil, and I owe someone there a drink." Sewell arched an eyebrow. "You're going to risk landing on a station full of cutthroats and thieves for a drink?" Rick shrugged. "It's a really good drink," Bite chimed in. "It's also the only place that hasn't banned him yet." Sewell shook her head. "You are the worst kind of human." Rick grinned. "A fun one? A reckless one?" "Well," he said, tapping a few buttons on the console. "Reckless keeps things interesting." Sewell sighed. She had been owned by many fools before, but this one might actually get her killed. Kovath Station looked exactly like the kind of place that would overcharge you for fuel and then stab you for asking why. The docking bay was dimly lit, the metal floors slick with something she didn't want to identify. A few mechanics in grease-stained jumpsuits lurked near the ships, watching with predatory interest as new arrivals stepped off their vessels. Sewell followed Rick down the ramp, her posture tense. Rick, on the other hand, looked completely relaxed. "I feel like I should warn you," she said, glancing around. "This is the kind of place where people disappear." "Hey," Rick waved a dismissive hand. "I don't have enough credits to be worth kidnapping." Sewell stared at him. "That is not comforting." Before she could argue further, a deep, gravelly voice called out, "Well, well, if it isn't Rick, the unkillable." Sewell turned her head and immediately realized why Kovath had been familiar. Because standing in front of them, arms crossed, was a very large, very unpleasant-looking alien. And he recognized her. The alien was massive, easily 7 feet tall, built like a wrecking ball. His skin was a deep shade of green, his face marked with 3 jagged scars that suggested he had survived something unpleasant. His arms were crossed, thick with muscle, and he had the kind of expression that made small children cry. Rick, to Sewell's complete horror, grinned. "Nex!" Rick spread his arms wide. "You're still alive. That's great news." Nex did not smile back. "Incredible news, really," Rick continued. "I mean, with all the people you've pissed off, I figured someone would have—" "I will kill you," Nex rumbled. Sewell took a step back. "Good. Great. This is fine." Nex's gaze flicked toward her. His eyes narrowed, scanning her face. Recognition sparked. "You," he murmured. Her pulse spiked. She knew that look. It was the look traders gave when they saw profit. Rick noticed the shift immediately, stepping in between them. His voice was too casual. Small galaxy, huh? You two know each other? Sewell's jaw tightened. Not personally. Nex exhaled through his nose. I saw you once, a long time ago. A trader tried to sell you. His gaze darkened. He didn't know what you were. Sewell kept her expression neutral, but inside, her mind was racing. Because Nex wasn't mocking her. He wasn't scoffing at her worthlessness. He was interested. Rick, to his credit, was already picking up on the tension. He shifted his weight slightly, shoulders squared, not quite threatening, but not backing down either. That's funny, Rick said, because she's not for sale. Nex's lips curled into something almost amused. I wonder if you know what you have. Sewell's fingers twitched toward the knife Rick had given her. She didn't know what she was. She didn't know why Nex suddenly found her important. But she knew one thing for certain. This was not just another sale. And whatever Nex thought he knew, it was dangerous. The silence between them stretched too long. Sewell could hear the faint hum of the space station's failing ventilation system, the distant chatter of traders haggling over spare ship parts, the click of someone adjusting a blaster's safety behind them. Nex's stare bore into her, not with the casual disinterest of someone looking at a worthless thing, but with recognition. That was what scared her the most. I don't know what you think I am, she said carefully, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. But I'm not for sale. Rick, standing beside her, gave a casual nod. Yeah, what she said. Then, as if realizing he had more to add, he turned back to Nex and wagged a finger. Also, I'd really appreciate it if you stopped looking at my friend like she's a rare antique you suddenly remembered is worth a fortune. It's creepy. Nex huffed a laugh, a deep, rumbling sound that suggested amusement, but held an edge of something darker. You should be careful, human. You don't know what you're carrying. Hey, neither do I, Sewell snapped. And it's my life. The alien considered her for a moment, then shrugged, a small, almost dismissive gesture. Maybe that's for the best. Rick narrowed his eyes. That sounded way too cryptic. Nex smirked. Then take the warning and go. And just like that, he turned and walked away, vanishing into the crowd. Sewell exhaled, not realizing she had been holding her breath. Rick rocked back on his heels, then clapped his hands together. Well, that was ominous. Time to get off this station before someone else decides to put a bounty on our heads. Bite's voice crackled over the comms unit strapped to Rick's wrist. Fun fact, there's already a bounty on your head. Rick groaned. Ugh, who this time? Someone named Krell the Butcher. Sewell blinked. The Butcher? Rick sighed. I may have accidentally sold him fake reactor fuel last year. Sewell rubbed her temples. You are actually the worst. I improvised. We need to leave. Agreed. The rust bucket shook violently as they pulled away from Kovath Station, its engines rattling in protest. Bite! Rick gritted through his teeth, gripping the controls. Are we leaking atmosphere? Not yet, the AI replied cheerfully. But I'd say there's a 70% chance we explode before dinner. Sewell, seated beside him, tightened the straps on her harness. You fly like a drunk asteroid. Hey, I get us where we need to go. Barely. The ship jerked to the left as they cleared the station's gravitational pull. Rick exhaled and leaned back in his chair, satisfied that they had survived. For now. Hours later, they drifted through space, the hum of the engines a soft lullaby after the chaos. Sewell sat across from Rick in the tiny, cluttered dining area, a half-full cup of questionable liquid in her hands. She wasn't sure what it was, only that Rick had offered it to her with the words, "Don't ask what's in it, just drink it." So, Rick said, tapping his fingers on the table. You want to talk about what that was back there? She considered lying, considered brushing it off, saying it didn't matter. But the truth had been clawing at the back of her mind ever since Nex had looked at her with something other than indifference. I don't know what I am, she admitted, voice quieter than she intended. But I know I was never supposed to exist. Rick didn't flinch, didn't react with shock or horror. He simply sipped from his own cup, nodding like she had just told him the weather forecast. Yeah, and? She blinked. That doesn't bother you? Why would it? Because it should? Rick set his cup down with a soft thunk. Look, Sewell, I don't know what Nex meant. Maybe you're some lost experiment. Maybe you're secret royalty. Maybe you're actually a time-traveling space ghost. She narrowed her eyes. That is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. See? You're fitting in already. She sighed, but a small, reluctant smile tugged at her lips. She had spent years being dragged from one trader to another, being told she was worthless, unwanted, a mistake. Now, sitting on a half-broken ship, listening to a reckless human crack dumb jokes, she realized something strange. For the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting to be sold. She wasn't waiting for someone else to decide her fate. She was here because she wanted to be. Rick stretched, yawning. Welp, I say we celebrate not dying by getting some sleep. Sewell rolled her eyes. Your bar for celebration is very low. You try living with a homicidal AI and a ship held together by spite. Spite's voice cut in. I heard that. Rick grinned. Good night, Bite. I hope your bed collapses. Sewell let out a breathless chuckle and stood. As she made her way toward her quarters, she hesitated in the doorway, glancing back. Rick? He looked up. She opened her mouth, wanted to thank him, wanted to acknowledge what he had done. Instead, she settled for, the rust bucket is still a piece of junk. Rick smirked. Yeah, but she's our piece of junk. She rolled her eyes, shaking her head as she disappeared down the hall. For once, she wasn't a thing to be owned. She wasn't a mistake. She was Sewell. And for now, that was enough. The battlefield lay in silence, the kind that only followed after the final shots had been fired, after the war machines had screamed their last, after the bodies had stopped twitching. The twin moons of Vir 7 hung low in the sky, their pale light stretching over the ruins of what had once been a Zalari war front. Smoke curled from the wreckage, thick with the acrid scent of burnt alloy, melted circuitry, and scorched flesh. The ground was littered with the remains of the fallen, some in twisted armor, others barely recognizable as anything once living. And among them, Elezithara lay motionless. She had fought until the last charge of energy burned through her veins, until her muscles had locked, and the nerves in her spine had finally given in. Paralyzed. Not dead, but close enough that her people had made no distinction. She had watched them leave, one by one, the warships lifting into the sky without so much as a backward glance. Zelari warriors did not burden themselves with the weak. There were no rescue missions, no medics dispatched to fallen soldiers. If you couldn't stand, if you couldn't fight, you were dead weight. And dead weight had no place in the Dominion. Elezithara had always known this. She had lived by the code. But knowing it and experiencing it were two different things. She had been one of the greatest, one of the fiercest warriors in the fleet, a strategist, a hunter of human soldiers. And now she was just a husk lying in the dirt, staring at the stars, waiting for the end. That was until she heard the voice. Ah, hell. Elezithara blinked. The words were in human standard. the guttural drawl unmistakably Terran. Footsteps crunched over the wreckage, slow and cautious. Whoever it was, they weren't rushing to loot her corpse, always a good sign. Or maybe a bad one, depending on the human. She shifted her eyes as much as she could, scanning the darkness, searching for the source of the voice. A shadow moved through the smoke, outlined against the flickering remains of burning metal. Human. Tall. Heavy boots, reinforced exo-armor, military, but not pristine. The edges of his armor were worn, patched together like he'd survived one too many close calls. His helmet was tucked under his arm, revealing a face lined with exhaustion, the kind that settled deep into the bones. Nathan Carter was having a very bad day. He sighed, running a gloved hand through his short, dark hair, then muttered to himself, Of course I find the one still breathing Zalari in this whole goddamn graveyard." Elizethara glared at him, or at least she tried to. The whole paralyzed thing was really putting a dent in her intimidation factor. Nathan exhaled sharply, tilting his head as he studied her. "You know, I could just leave you here. Would be the smart thing to do. I could turn around, pretend I didn't see anything, and get back to my ship. Sleep like a baby." He paused. "Well, more like an insomniac with a drinking problem, but you get the point." She said nothing. Not that she could. Her throat was dry, her body unresponsive. "Right," he muttered, rubbing his temple. "Talking to myself again? That's a great sign, Nathan. Real healthy behavior." He crouched beside her, and for a moment she thought he was going to finish what the Zellery had started. A plasma shot to the head, quick, efficient, merciful even. Instead, he reached for a small scanner on his wrist and ran it over her body. The device beeped as it processed the data, the results flickering over his visor. "Oh, well, that's just great," he grumbled. "Paralysis. Nerve damage. Yeah, you're in real good shape." Elizethara tried to summon some dignity, but dignity was difficult when you were sprawled on the ground like discarded cargo. Nathan groaned and rubbed his face. "God damn it. I knew I was going to regret this." Then, with another sigh that sounded like it carried the weight of 1,000 poor life choices, he stood and turned away. And for the first time since the battle ended, Elizethara felt something close to fear. She hadn't been afraid when she fought. She hadn't been afraid when she fell. She hadn't even been afraid when her people left her to die. But now, as the human walked away, as the sound of his footsteps grew fainter, something inside her twisted. She had survived battles, explosions, close-quarters combat. She had survived humans, but she would not survive this world alone. Not like this. She forced her throat to work, forced her dry tongue against her teeth, forced the air through her lungs. "Wait!" Nathan stopped mid-step. Elizethara's breath hitched. That single word had cost her more than she cared to admit. But it had worked. He was turning, looking down at her with a face that was far too amused for someone who had just found an enemy warrior in need of help. His lips twitched. "Oh, great. You can talk." She tried again, voice rasping. "You will regret this." Nathan barked out a short laugh. "Yeah? Sweetheart, I regret everything. What's one more bad decision?" And with that, he crouched down again and started hauling her onto a makeshift stretcher of metal plating and scavenged fabric, muttering to himself the entire time. "If I die because of this, I'm gonna haunt my own damn grave." Nathan Carter wasn't built for good deeds. In fact, he was pretty sure they went against everything his survival instincts had taught him. And yet, here he was, dragging a paralyzed Zellery warrior across the battlefield like some idiot protagonist in a bad war movie. "Yeah, This is definitely
Bitte
how I die.
sagen Sie den geschätzten Vertretern der Erde, dass Ihre Versuche der
The stretch of wreckage around them was eerily silent. The usual sounds of war, distant explosions, gunfire, the mechanical whine of patrol drones, replaced by an unnatural stillness. The Zalari had pulled out completely, leaving nothing but their dead and whatever wreckage wasn't worth salvaging. Typical. They never wasted resources, not even on their own people. "You hearing me, warrior princess?" Nathan huffed, adjusting his grip on the stretcher's handles. "I want it on record that this is a terrible idea." Isla Zathara, the warrior in question, had her head tilted slightly, violet eyes half-lidded in exhaustion. She'd barely spoken since he'd hoisted her onto the damn thing, which was probably for the best, considering her first words to him had been a death threat. He should leave her. He knew that. A human soldier and a crippled Zellery? That was just a slow-motion disaster waiting to happen. But then he'd seen her eyes, sharp and bright, filled with something that wasn't quite defiance, but wasn't surrender either. Nathan groaned. He hated complicated situations. "You're either gonna get me killed or make me look like the biggest sucker in the galaxy," he grumbled as he started moving again. Elizthara managed a dry whisper. "Both. Seem likely." Nathan barked out a laugh despite himself. "Oh, great. She's got jokes now. That's fantastic." She didn't respond, and when he glanced at her again, her expression had gone slack. Not unconscious, but dangerously close. "Hey, hey," he said, nudging her shoulder. Not that she'd feel it. "Don't you pass out on me. I just committed like half a war crime rescuing you, and I am not carrying your dead weight back to my ship." Her eyelids fluttered. "You talk too much." "Yeah. Well, you're welcome." The ship wasn't far now. The Blue Vulture was no pristine military vessel. It was more like an aging scrapyard reject with just enough functional parts to keep flying. The hull was patched together with mismatched plating, and the engines made a sound like an asthmatic reactor every time they fired up. But it was home. Nathan hauled the stretcher up the ramp, muttering curses the whole way, and kicked the panel to close the ship behind him. The moment the door sealed, he let out a breath and leaned against the wall, staring down at his unexpected passenger. "All right, warrior princess. Welcome to my very ugly, very poorly maintained spaceship." Isla Zathara barely turned her head. "This is a mistake." "Yeah, well," Nathan sighed, hauling her into the medbay. "I have a long history of those." The ship's medbay was small because Nathan had never really needed a medbay. Sure, he got shot at a lot, but he was more of a slap a bandage, on it and keep moving kind of guy. The Zilari, though, she needed something a little more advanced. Nathan plugged in the neural stimulator and glanced down at her. "All right, let's see what we're dealing with." A holographic display flickered to life, showing a full-body scan of Isla Zathara's nervous system. The paralysis wasn't total, but it was damn close. Spinal nerve trauma, disrupted bioelectric pathways, and what looked like some kind of Zilari nanite system that had completely shut down. He frowned. "Huh? So, your fancy alien body basically just turned the lights off?" Isla Zathara exhaled slowly. "The Zellery prioritize efficiency." That's a real polite way of saying they abandon people who can't walk. Her expression barely shifted, but he saw something flicker behind her eyes. "You want to tell me why your own people left you to rot?" She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than before. "They do not waste resources on the broken." Nathan scoffed. "Wow, real warm and fuzzy culture you got there." Her eyes narrowed slightly. Your people would do the same. Hey, Nathan wobbled his hand. Depends on which humans. Some would leave you. Some would shoot you. Some would start a GoFundMe. She blinked at him. A what? Nathan grinned. Don't worry about it. The scanner beeped, and he turned his attention back to the readout. He wasn't a doctor, but he'd patched himself up enough times to know that she wasn't beyond saving. The paralysis wasn't permanent, but it was going to take time. Not that she seemed thrilled by the idea. Zathara stared at the ceiling, her jaw tight. I will not be a prisoner. Lady, do I look like I have the resources to imprison anyone? Nathan gestured at the ship around them. I don't even have enough rations for myself. You think I planned for a guest? Her fingers twitched slightly. Not much, but enough for him to notice. She noticed, too. Her breath caught. A spark of something flashed in her gaze. Hope? No, not hope. Determination. Nathan leaned against the counter. Guess that means you're not totally screwed, huh? She exhaled slowly. Not yet. Nathan nodded. Cool. That means I didn't just risk my ass for nothing. Zathara studied him for a long moment. You did not have to help me. Yeah, well, he sighed. I make bad decisions. It's kind of my whole deal. There was silence between them for a while. The hum of the ship, the occasional beep of the medical scanner, the distant thrum of the engines. Then, finally, Zathara spoke. I will not be weak. Nathan smirked. I'd be real surprised if you were. She closed her eyes, and for the first time since the battle, she allowed herself to rest. Nathan watched her for a moment longer, then exhaled. Yeah, he muttered to himself, rubbing his face. I'm gonna regret this. The blue vulture rattled as it drifted through space, its patched-up engines humming with the kind of optimism usually reserved for machines that didn't know any better. The ship had seen better days. Hell, it had seen better decades. But it was still flying, which was more than Nathan could say for most things he'd been responsible for. The same could be said for his passenger. Zathara was alive. Barely. Her body remained stubbornly uncooperative.
Thì mình sẽ cần chuẩn bị là từ khóa chính, từ khóa chiến đó, tên kênh và URL của kênh, đi tàu phải, đi chọn.
Nathan stood in the doorway of the med bay, arms crossed, watching her with the kind of tired curiosity one might have for a very angry, very injured cat. You planning on waking up anytime soon? He muttered. 'Cause I gotta tell you, talking to myself's only fun when there's alcohol involved. Zathara stirred, eyelids fluttering open with a sluggishness that suggested her body still wasn't on speaking terms with the rest of her. Her violet eyes locked onto him, their usual sharpness dulled by exhaustion. How long? Her voice was rough, but there was no weakness in it, just a simple demand for information. 3 days, Nathan replied, leaning against the wall. You've been real fun company. Hardly any backtalk, barely any death threats. Honestly, I'm kinda disappointed. Zathara exhaled, her fingers twitching against the cot. She felt heavier than before, as if the weight of her useless limbs had only increased with time. Paralysis was a cage, and she was trapped in it. Nathan seemed to sense her frustration. Hey, don't get all dramatic. You're doing better than you were when I found you. You talked, you moved a finger. At this rate, you'll be walking in, what, a few years? She shot him a glare so sharp he could have used it to cut wires. He grinned. Ah, there it is. That's the terrifying murder stare I was waiting for. She ignored him, shifting her focus to the ceiling. Where are we? Middle of nowhere, Nathan said, waving a hand vaguely. Figured that was safer than anywhere specific. The Zellery and the Terran military Both got real trigger happy after that last battle. Didn't seem smart to stick around. Ilezithara's expression remained unreadable. She had no home to return to. Not anymore. If her people considered her broken, she was as good as dead to them. And the humans? They were no more likely to welcome a former Zalari war leader than they were to start offering free hugs to every alien they met.
Đi tù.
So, what's the plan, warrior princess?
Mọi người copy từ khóa chính,
Because
vứt vào các phần chỉnh sửa, được phép chỉnh sửa.
And my ship doesn't exactly come with 5-star rehab facilities.
File, mọi người nhấn apply, mọi người làm cái này.
Then, carefully, she forced her fingers to move, just a fraction of an inch.
Lần lượt, vì là trước đây các lần lượt và ít một. Trước đây có nhiều anh em là làm một loạt hết, điền một loạt hết, xong sẽ bị mất hết thông tin, nó sẽ không được đầy đủ. Đó, mọi người cứ làm
Keeps things interesting.
một chút một. Đây là 5 người
Are you always like this? He grinned. Oh,
phép
absolutely.
chỉnh sửa
She sighed,
của file.
closing her eyes again. Unfortunate. Nathan chuckled, pushing off the wall. All right, I'll leave you to your existential crisis. Try not to stress too much. It's bad for your nerves, which, you know, are already real unhappy with you. He turned to leave, but before he could step out of the room, her voice stopped him. Nathan. He glanced back, surprised she'd used his name. Up until now, it had just been human, or whatever insult she was holding in at the moment. Ilezithara's eyes were open again, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Why did you save me? For once, Nathan didn't have a smart-ass answer ready. He shrugged.
Fractured.
Hell
The
if
queen
I
banked
know.
sharply, her wings
That
slicing
wasn't
through the
entirely
kaleidoscopic
true,
sky with
but it was
effortless
easier
grace.
than trying to
Below them
explain the
stretched
way
a
he'd
landscape
felt
that defied
when he
description.
first saw her.
An endless expanse
Broken,
of floating
but
islands
still
suspended
alive,
in midair,
still
connected
fighting
by
even
bridges
as
of
her
light
body
and
betrayed
shadow.
her.
Towering
It
spires
wasn't
jutted
pity.
upward from
It
some
wasn't
of the
guilt.
larger land masses.
It was just
their surfaces etched
something.
with symbols similar to
And
those on the
something
swords.
was better than
Rivers
nothing.
of liquid starlight
Nathan
flowed
forced
between
a
the
grin.
islands,
Guess
cascading
I just
into
have a
abyssal
thing
chasms
for lost
that glowed
causes.
faintly with an inner luminescence.
Ilezithara studied
She
him for a
descended
moment
toward
longer,
one of the larger
then closed her
islands,
eyes.
her movements deliberate
Foolish.
and precise.
He laughed.
As
Yeah,
they drew nearer,
that too.
he noticed structures
And with
scattered
that,
across its
he
surface.
left her to rest,
Buildings unlike
already
any he'd
wondering
ever
how
seen,
much more
their
trouble he'd
architecture
just
both
signed
alien
himself
and
up
hauntingly
for.
familiar.
The
Some
Zellery
resembled
warship
cathedrals,
loomed ahead,
their spires
a
reaching
dark
skyward,
beast against the
while others
stars,
looked like organic
its angular
growths,
hull
twisting and
reflecting the
curling
cold
as if
light
alive.
of space.
Between these structures
Even from a
stood
distance,
statues,
Nathan could
humanoid
tell
figures
it was
carved
built
from obsidian
for
and marble,
efficiency.
their faces
Sharp
obscured by
lines,
intricate
no
masks.
wasted
The
space,
queen landed
no
softly
excess
on the edge of the island,
ornamentation.
folding her wings
It looked
neatly
like it
against
had
her
been
sides.
engineered by someone
turned
who
her head
thought
toward him,
emotions were a
her
waste of
golden eyes
processing
gleaming with
power,
anticipation,
which,
or perhaps
frankly,
warning.
made a lot of
Whatever awaited
sense
them here,
considering the
it
kind
was
of
clear
people
she intended for
Ilezithara
him
had
to
come
face
from.
it alongside her.
Nathan
Sliding off her
drummed his
back,
fingers
he
against
planted
the
his feet
console of
firmly
the
on
Blue
ground,
Vulture,
which shimmered
staring
faintly
at the
beneath his
docking bay
weight.
doors
The
slowly
swords
opening in
vibrated
front of him.
insistently in his hand.
This was it.
Their energy
He was
resonating
handing
with
her
the
back,
environment around them.
dropping her
He
off
took a
like a
cautious
lost
step
package.
forward, scanning
He
the
should be
horizon for
relieved.
signs of movement.
But he
The
wasn't.
air was eerily silent
Behind
now,
him,
save for the
Elizithara
soft
sat
hum of the
strapped
swords
into
and
a
the
seat,
distant rush of
her
starlit
movements
rivers.
slow
A
but
sudden
functional.
shift in the atmosphere
3
made him
weeks
pause.
of neural
The
stimulation,
colors of the sky darkened,
improvisational
bleeding
physical
into shades of
therapy,
indigo
and
black.
stubborn willpower
Shadows
had
lengthened
brought her from
unnaturally,
full
stretching
paralysis
across the
to
ground
something
like grasping
almost
fingers.
resembling
From the
mobility.
nearest structure emerged
Her
a figure,
fingers
a
flexed against
humanoid
the
silhouette
armrest,
cloaked in tattered
still
robes
weaker
that
than
seemed
she
woven
liked,
from darkness
but
itself.
not useless.
Its face was hidden
And
beneath
that
a mask
alone had
identical to
changed
those adorning the
everything.
statues.
She
Its
was no
edges
longer
glowing
the
faintly
warrior
with an
left for
ominous
dead
red
on a
light.
battlefield.
The figure raised
She
an
wasn't
arm,
the same
pointing
woman Nathan
directly
had
at him.
found.
Behind
Nor
it,
was she
more
the
shapes
same
began to
Zalari,
emerge from the
who
shadows,
had once viewed
their
humans
forms
as nothing
indistinct
more
but
than
undeniably
targets.
hostile.
But what
The
was
queen
she
let out a
now?
low growl,
That was the
positioning herself
million credit
protectively
question.
between him and the advancing
Nathan
horde.
flicked a switch,
Her wings
opening a
unfurled
comms
slightly,
channel.
ready to strike or
All right,
shield as
Zalari
needed.
Command, I
He
got your
tightened his
missing
grip on the
warrior.
swords,
She's
their
still
warmth
kicking.
anchoring him
Well,
amidst the
metaphorically
encroaching dread.
speaking,
Whatever
because her
battle
legs
awaited
still
them
kind of
here,
suck.
he knew it would test
A voice
not only
crackled
his
through the
strength, but his very
speakers,
soul.
clipped and
And yet,
emotionless.
as he stood there facing
Confirmed.
the unknown,
Prepare
he
for
felt
transfer.
no regret,
Your
only
cooperation
determination.
is
For
acknowledged.
better or worse,
Nathan
This
made a
journey had
face.
become his destiny.
Wow,
The
you
figure in the
guys
tattered
really know
robes
how to
stepped
make a
forward,
guy feel special.
its movements unervingly
Isla
fluid,
Zithara said
as though
nothing,
it glided
her
rather
gaze
than walked.
locked on the
The
warship.
mask it wore seemed to pulse
There was
with a
something
malevolent
tight in her
energy,
expression,
the red glow
something
intensifying
unreadable.
with each step it took.
He frowned.
Behind it, the shadowy
You
horde
good?
spread out, their
She didn't
forms
look at him.
shifting and writhing
They
like
will
smoke
assess me.
given life.
Yeah?
They didn't speak or make any
Nathan
sound,
leaned back.
but their presence
then
alone
what?
was suffocating.
Her fingers
A weight
tightened on
pressing
the
down on his
armrest.
chest,
If I am
threatening to
still
crush him
considered
beneath
useful,
its enormity.
they will
The
reinstate
queen
me.
let out a low, guttural
And
roar,
if
her
not,
body coiling tightly
beat of
as if
silence.
preparing to strike.
then,
Her
quietly,
wings flared outward,
they will finish
casting
what they
long
started.
shadows that mingled with
Nathan
the
stared
encroaching
at her.
darkness. The
You
air
do
around them
realize that's
crackled with
completely
tension,
insane,
charged
right?
by the opposing forces.
Isla Zithara
The queen's
exhaled
radiant
slowly.
power and the oppressive
It
void
is the way
exuded
of
by
my
the
people.
masked figure and its followers.
Yeah, well,
He tightened his
your
grip
people
on the
suck.
swords,
She
their
smirked slightly.
vibrations growing erratic,
That is
almost frantic.
a fair
Les deux fils jumeaux de vue brillaient à leur zénith, brûlant le ciel en une tapisserie fondue d'or et d'écarlate lorsque le premier
Nathan glanced at the airlock controls, then back at her. Well,
He could
he
feel
said,
their energy
rubbing the
coursing
back
through
of his
him,
neck.
bolstering his
Guess
resolve
I'll just
even
be
as
on my
doubt
way
clawed
then.
at the edges of his
Try
mind.
not to die,
Who
yeah?
or what
Isla
were these
Zithara
beings?
rose
And why
unsteadily
did
to
they
her
seem
feet,
so intent
her
on
body
stopping
still
him?
adjusting
The
to its
masked
newfound
figure stopped
strength.
just a few paces away,
The soldiers didn't
tilting its
move
head
to assist
slightly
her.
as if studying
They
him.
simply watched.
Then, without warning,
Nathan
it
hated
raised
them
both
immediately.
arms, and the
She took
ground
one
beneath
step
them
toward the
began
airlock,
to tremble violently.
then another.
Cracks splintered
Then
across the shimmering
she
surface
stopped.
of the island,
Slowly,
glowing faintly
deliberately,
with the same ominous
she turned to
red
face
light
him,
as the
her
figure's
violet
mask.
eyes sharp,
From the fissures
calculating.
emerged more creatures,
And then,
twisted
his
amalgamations of
absolute
flesh
shock,
and metal.
she
their
turned
eyes
back to the
burning with
soldiers and
hatred.
said,
They moved
I will
with
not
mechanical
return.
precision,
the
surrounding them
airlock,
in a tightening
which had been
circle.
so damn quiet a
Stay
second
close,
ago,
he
suddenly
muttered
felt
under his
way
breath,
too
though
loud.
whether he was speaking to
Nathan
himself
blinked.
or the queen,
Wait,
he wasn't sure.
what?
She
The
responded
lead
with a
soldier,
low rumble,
an officer,
her
judging
massive
by the
frame
insignia,
shifting protectively
tilted his
beside
head
him.
slightly.
Together, they
That
formed
is
an
not your
unspoken
decision to
alliance.
make.
Two beings bound
Isla
by
Zithara's
circumstance
stance
and purpose,
shifted,
facing
shoulders
an enemy
squaring.
neither fully understood.
It is.
One of the metallic creatures
The officer's
lunged
gaze
first,
flicked between
its
her and
claws
Nathan.
gleaming wickedly in the
This
dim
human
light.
has
The queen
clouded your
reacted
mind.
instantly, swiping
Nathan
one of her
raised a
powerful
hand.
limbs and sending the creature crashing
hello?
into the nearest structure.
I'm standing right here.
Stone shattered upon impact,
Isla Zithara
sending
ignored him.
shards flying in
I
all
am not weak,
directions.
she said.
But for every
voice
foe she
steady.
dispatched,
I am not
two more
useless,
seemed to take its
but
place.
I will not serve
The horde
those who
was
abandoned
endless,
me.
spilling forth from
The
the
officer's
cracks like
expression
water
remained
breaching a dam.
unreadable.
Realizing
Then,
they couldn't hold
after
this
a long
position
pause, he
indefinitely,
said,
he stepped forward,
Then you are an
raising
Non,
enemy of
his
je...
sword.
dominion.
Les deux fils jumeaux de vue brillaient à leur zénith, brûlant le ciel en une tapisserie fondue d'or et d'écarlate lorsque le premier frémit.
Taking advantage of the
The officer
distraction,
ignored him,
he swung the
signaling
first
to
sword
his
in
men.
a wide arc,
Kill
releasing
them.
a wave of energy
Whoa,
that cut
whoa,
through several
whoa.
of the creatures at once.
Nathan barely
They
had time to
dissolved
reach
into
for his
ash,
sidearm
their forms
before Isla
disintegrating
Zithara
before
moved.
they hit the ground.
She wasn't at full strength,
Encouraged by the success,
not even close,
he pressed onward,
but she didn't need to
striking
be.
with a ferocity he
With the
didn't
kind
know
of
he
precision
possessed.
only a trained
Each
warrior
blow
had,
resonated with the
she
sword's
grabbed
power,
the nearest soldier's
amplifying
weapon
his strength
and used it
tenfold.
against him.
Yet with every
The
strike,
plasma
he
blast
felt a piece of
seared through
himself
his
being
armor
drained.
before he had time
His
to
stamina,
react.
his focus,
Nathan,
his very essence.
catching up quickly,
The sword
shot the
demanded a
second
price,
soldier in the
and
leg,
he was paying it
sending him
willingly,
crumpling to
driven
the
by
ground with a
desperation
shout.
and the need to survive.
The officer barely
The queen
flinched.
fought
Les formes
alongside him,
fantomatiques se tordaient contre le ciel parsemé d'étoiles et au-delà, le vaisseau de guerre se dressait en orbite tel un
impaling multiple
They
foes at
threw
once,
me away
while her
first.
wings created
Nathan
gusts
grabbed
strong
her
enough
arm.
to scatter the smaller
Time to
creatures
go,
like
warrior
leaves in a storm.
princess.
Despite
They
their combined
sprinted.
efforts, however,
Well,
the tide
Nathan
showed no
sprinted,
sign of turning.
while Isla
For
Zithara
every
did an
enemy they
aggressive
felled,
fast walk
more emerged,
back toward the ship.
relentless and unyielding.
The moment they crossed
Then,
the threshold,
the masked figure
Nathan
finally
slammed
acted.
the emergency
With a
launch
sharp
controls,
gesture, it summoned a
disengaging the
swirling
docking
vortex of
clamps.
shadows directly
The
above
blue
them.
vulture
The
tore
darkness
free from the
descended
warship,
rapidly,
engines
enveloping
screaming,
everything in its path.
alarms blaring.
Visibility dropped to
Plasma
near zero,
shots
and the
streaked past
cacophony of
them as
battle
they dove
faded
into
an
open
eerie
space.
silence.
But
All he
Nathan
could
knew
hear
one
was the
thing
steady
for
thrum
certain.
of the swords in his hands
They
and
weren't
the rhythmic
going back.
beating of his own heart.
Isla Zithara,
Instinctively,
still
he
catching her
reached out
breath,
with one hand,
slumped into the
finding
co-pilot
the
seat.
queen's armored
Nathan
side.
glanced at her.
Her warmth anchored him
So,
amidst amidst the suffocating void,
What now?
grounding him when all
She
else
looked at
threatened to overwhelm.
Then, in a
"We
rare
can't
moment
stay
of complete
here," he
sincerity,
whispered
she said,
hoarsely, unsure
"We
if she could
survived."
understand him.
Nathan
But she
smirked.
responded immediately,
"Yeah,
nudging
I can
him
work
gently
with that."
toward what he assumed
And
was the
together,
direction
they
of the
disappeared
vortex's
into
edge.
the stars.
They moved cautiously, the sword's light barely piercing the oppressive gloom. Every step felt heavier
The glow
than the last,
of the twin
as though the
moons
shadows
bathed the
themselves
Vishari
sought to pull
capital
them
in a
back.
soft,
He
pale
slashed blindly
radiance,
at the darkness,
turning
hoping
its
to clear a
needle-like
path,
towers
but the
into
void simply
spires of
swallowed the
liquid
energy,
silver.
leaving them trapped within
The
its
air
grasp.
was thick with the
Suddenly,
hum of the city.
queen let out a deafening
Whispers
roar,
of thousands
her voice
of
cutting through the
interconnected
silence like
minds
a blade.
weaving in and
The
out
sound
of each other
reverberated
like
through
an
the vortex,
unseen tide,
causing the
ebbing
shadows to
and
ripple
flowing
and
through
distort.
the streets,
Seizing the
through the
opportunity,
skywalks,
she surged
through the
forward,
very
dragging him
bones
along
of the
with her.
world.
The force of her movement propelled
Zivara
them out
stood
of the
in the
vortex
shadow
and
of
into
a
open
towering
space
monument,
once more.
her
They
arms
landed
folded
hard on the
tightly,
shimmering ground,
watching as the grand
impact knocking
plaza
the wind
filled
from his
with
lungs.
bonded pairs,
Gasping for
gliding
air,
in
he rolled
perfect
onto his
sync.
back, staring up
Even
at the
without turning her
kaleidoscopic
head,
sky now marred
she
by
could feel the
streaks of
subtle
black.
shifts of
The
their
horde had
shared
regrouped,
consciousness,
their numbers
a dance of
undiminished.
thoughts
But there was
that
something
never
different
included
about them
her.
now. They
She
hesitated,
wasn't
their
invited
attention
into
Un
their
éclair
world.
rugissant déchira le
She
ciel
now had
au-dessus,
a
baignant la place
city
d'une lumière.
fact in her mind. If you ask the scholars, they called it an unresolved neurological impairment. If you ask the people, it was simply a curse,
It was then that he realized
a failure
the
of
figure wasn't
evolution,
merely commanding
a
the horde,
severed
it
thread
was
in the
drawing
vast
power from them,
tapestry of the
channeling their
Vishari
collective
race.
energy into some
She
greater
tried
purpose.
not to care.
And whatever that
She
purpose
told
was,
herself
it
over
involved
and
him.
over
The
that
queen
she
let
did
out
not
another
need a
roar,
bond,
snapping
that
him
she
out
did
of his
not
thoughts.
want one.
She positioned herself
But
between
deep down,
him and the figure,
in the dark hours
her
of the
body
night,
tense and
she
ready to
sometimes
strike.
let herself
But before
imagine what
either
it
of them
might
could
be
act,
like to slip
the
into
masked
someone's
figure lowered its
thoughts,
arms,
to feel
pointing
them as
directly at
easily
him.
as
A
breathing,
beam of crimson
to
light
never
shot
be
forth,
alone in her own
striking
head
the
again.
ground mere inches from
She
where he
shook
stood.
off the thought
The
and
impact sent
exhaled,
shockwaves rippling
watching a
outward,
group of
forcing him
Vishari
to stumble
youths
backward.
glide past in a
Desperation
synchronized
surged within
stream
him,
of
fueling
effortless
his
movement.
resolve.
Every
Clutching the
step
swords tightly,
perfectly in
he charged
tune,
forward,
every
ignoring
glance
the fatigue
filled with
weighing down his
unspoken
limbs.
words
The horde
only
closed in
they
around
could
him,
hear.
but he cut through them with
Zivara
renewed
had
vigor,
tried once,
each
as a
swing of the
child,
swords
to
carving
mimic
paths
them.
of destruction.
She'd followed the
queen followed
rituals,
closely behind,
recited the
her
ancient
presence a constant
incantations that
reminder
were
that he
supposed to
wasn't
make
alone.
the bond
As he
awaken.
neared the statue,
Nothing.
the masked figure leapt
Her
down,
mother had told her
landing gracefully
gently
before him.
that she was
Up
different.
close, its mask
Her
seemed
father
even
had
more
been less
menacing,
gentle.
the red glow
No
searing
one
into his
will
vision.
bond with a
It
ghost,
raised a hand,
Zivara.
and he braced himself for
She
another
clenched her
attack.
fists at the
But
memory,
instead of striking,
and then
it
she
spoke.
heard it,
Its voice
the
was
distinct
not human,
clank
a distorted
of
blend
military
of whispers
boots,
and echoes that
an uneven
reverberated
gait
in his skull.
that suggested
"You
either a
carry the
serious
keys,"
injury
it
or an
intoned,
inability to
gesturing
walk
toward
like
the
a normal
swords.
person.
But do you truly
She turned
understand
just
what
as
they
the human
unlock?
entered the
He
plaza.
froze,
Elias
uncertainty
Vance
creeping into
had a
his
look
mind.
about him that
What did
screamed,
it mean?
"I was
Were
not
the
supposed to
swords
be
truly
here,
keys,
and
as the
I know
figure
it."
claimed? And
His
if
dark,
so,
close-cropped
what door
hair
awaited
was
them
slightly
beyond this
unkempt.
battlefield?
His
Before
uniform
he could
creased in a
respond,
way that
the queen
suggested
intervened,
he hadn't so much
slamming
put
one of
it
her
on
massive limbs
as
into the
wrestled
figure
it
and
into
sending it
submission.
sprawling. The
He
horde
carried
surged
himself
forward
with a sort
again,
of casual
their attacks
arrogance,
fiercer than ever.
hands shoved into his
Exhaustion clawed
jacket
at him,
pockets,
threatening to drag
expression
him under,
unreadable.
but he refused to
The
yield.
other Vishari
Not yet.
reacted
Not
instinctively.
while the truth remained
Some
just
stepped
out
back,
of reach.
others
With a final
stiffened,
cry of defiance,
and as was their
he
way,
drove the
they
swords
all
into the
shared a
ground,
silent,
unleashing a
telepathic
burst of
ripple
energy
of
that
concern.
illuminated the entire island.
Zivara
The
wasn't
horde
privy to
faltered,
the exchange,
their forms
but she
dissolving
didn't need
into
to be.
nothingness.
She had
The
seen
masked
that
figure
exact
staggered,
reaction
its mask
thousands of
flickering
times,
erratically
just
before
never
shattering
directed
entirely.
at anyone other
For a
than
moment,
herself.
silence
And then,
reigned.
to her horror,
Then the
he
ground
made a
beneath them
beeline
began to quake
directly
once
for
more,
her.
and the sky above
"Hey,"
fractured like
Elias
glass.
said, as if
Whatever
they
had
were
been
old
unleashed,
friends.
it was
"You
far
look like
from
you're
over.
about 5
The
seconds
fractured
away
sky
from
above
murdering
them split
someone.
open, revealing
Thought
a
I'd say
churning
hi
void that
before
pulsed
I
with
made
an
the
ominous
list."
light. The
Zivara
queen let
blinked.
out a low growl,
He
her
spoke
body
to her.
trembling as if sensing
Not in the way the
gravity of what
Vishari
was
spoke
to
to
come.
one another,
He pulled the
not in the
swords from
silent,
ground,
seamless
their glow
connection of
dimming
their
slightly,
shared
but
thoughts.
still steady in his
No,
hands.
he
"We've done
actually
something,"
used words,
he muttered, more
spoken
to himself
aloud,
than to her.
like some
But
kind
what?
of savage.
The masked figure,
She stared at
now
him,
unmasked
stunned
and
into
revealed as a
silence.
shadowy wisp,
"What?
floated
No
upward
response?"
toward the rift.
Elias
It
continued.
turned back briefly,
"Usually when
its
I walk
form
into a
flickering
room,
like a dying
at least
flame.
somebody
You have only
starts
begun.
screaming."
Les deux fils
She
jumeaux.
glanced
Its
around.
voice carrying both
This is
warning
actually kind
and
of refreshing.
inevitability.
She
Then
narrowed her
it
eyes.
vanished into the void.
"You're making a
The
scene.
quaking grew violent.
You're the one
Cracks spreading
glaring at
across the
people like
island
you're
like
trying to
veins.
set them on
The
fire with
queen
your
nudged
mind.
him urgently.
de vue
and
brillaient à leur zénith.
Through her nose,
There was
turning her
no
gaze
time to
back to the
hesitate.
shifting crowds.
He climbed aboard,
They think you
gripping
don't
the swords
belong.
tightly as she launched
Elias
herself
grinned.
into the air.
You mean
Below,
we
the
don't
floating
belong?
islands began to collapse,
That made her stiffen.
consumed by the
He
expanding
let the words
rift.
hang there for
The
a moment,
kaleidoscopic
watching
colors
her
bled
reaction.
away, replaced by an endless
So,
expanse of
what's
darkness.
your story? He
Lightning
asked.
arced through the void,
She turned to him,
illuminating
expecting
glimpses of
mockery,
colossal shapes
but his
moving just
expression
beyond
was
sight.
unreadable.
As they ascended
Half
higher,
curiosity,
the queen's wings
half
beat
something
furiously
else she
against the
couldn't
pull
quite
of the
place.
abyss. Her
She
golden eyes
considered
locked
brushing
onto
him
his,
off.
filled
She
with
had no
determination
obligation to explain
perhaps
herself to
fear.
some strange,
Whatever awaited them
unbonded
next,
alien.
they would face it
But
together.
there was something
The
in the
swords
way he
pulsed
looked at her.
faintly, their
as
energy
if he
syncing with the rhythm of
expected
their
an
flight.
answer.
He glanced
that
down
made
at
her
them,
hesitate.
realizing for the first time
You
how much
wouldn't
they had
understand.
changed him. They weren't
Elias
just weapons.
shrugged.
They were burdens,
Try me.
responsibilities he
She
hadn't
studied
asked for
him,
but couldn't
searching
abandon.
for the trap.
Ahead, the void
But there was no
stretched
malice in
endlessly,
his expression,
swallowing stars
no
and
quiet
galaxies
thread
whole.
of shared laughter
Yet
at her
within its
expense.
depths, he saw
Only
something,
patience.
a faint glimmer of
So,
hope,
against her
a
better
single point
judgment,
of light,
she told him,
fragile but persistent,
everything.
calling to him.
just
The queen
enough.
roared, angling
Enough
her
to see
body
if he
toward
would
the light.
flinch.
For a
She
moment,
told him of the
everything
defect,
seemed possible.
the failed
Then,
bonds,
without warning,
the way
the
her
rift
own
surged,
people looked at her,
pulling them
not
downward
as
with
a person,
unstoppable force.
but as something
Hold on,
broken.
He shouted,
When she
though
finished,
he wasn't
she
sure who he was
expected him to
speaking
look
to.
uncomfortable,
Himself,
maybe even pity
queen,
her.
or the
Instead,
universe itself.
Elias just
And as they
snorted.
plummeted into the unknown,
Well, that's
the
dumb.
swords flared
She
one
blinked.
final time,
Excuse
bathing them
me?
in radiant light.
That's dumb, he repeated. They think you're lesser because you don't have what they have? That's like saying I'm a worse pilot because I don't have wings. He gestured vaguely at the sky. Which, by the way, I don't, in case that wasn't obvious. She stared at him. Who was this human? Before she could respond, a hush fell over the plaza. The air shifted, the psychic tide withdrawing like a receding wave. Zivara stiffened as a procession approached. The High Council. Her stomach twisted. She knew what this was about before they even spoke. They had seen her interaction with Elias. They had been watching. And when the eldest of them spoke, his voice was like steel wrapped in silk. You have been given an opportunity, Zivara, he said. One that may yet prove useful. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew what he meant. A test, a chance, and above all else, a warning. She had spent her whole life being told
Mọi người nhấn apply, mọi người làm cái này lần lượt.
the council
Vì là trước đây các
useful. All because of the
lần lượt và ít một. Trước đây có lần lượt và ít một. Trước đây có nhiều anh em là làm một loạt hết, điền một loạt hết, xong sẽ bị mất. Trước đây có nhiều anh
wanted to groan. This was going to be a disaster.
lượt và ít một. Trước đây có nhiều anh em là làm một loạt hết, điền một loạt, được phép chỉnh sửa của file. Mọi người nhấn apply.
In the dim light. Zivara had always found the place suffocating, even as a child. It was where laws were passed, fates decided, futures carved in stone. And now,
Người làm cái này lần lượt. Vì là trước đây các lần lượt và ít một. Trước đây có nhiều anh em là làm một loạt hết, điền một loạt hết, xong sẽ bị mất hết thông tin, nó sẽ không được đầy đủ. Đó, mọi người cứ làm một chút một. Đây là
or is this a special occasion? Zivara inhaled sharply. Be quiet. Not my strong suit. The eldest counselor, a towering Vishari male with skin like burnished steel, lifted his hand in a gesture of silence. An unnecessary.
5 mọi người điền cho mình là 5.
Vishari didn't actually speak in the way Elias did. The air in the chamber thrummed with their shared thoughts, a silent current of observation and scrutiny. Zivara, the unbonded, the outcast. She forced herself to meet their gazes, though her stomach twisted. A new experiment was at hand. The eldest counselor intoned, his thoughts rippling outward. The human lacks the bond, as you do.
Nhấn apply.
He does not suffer for it.
Tiếp tục phần dưới này sẽ là tên kênh.
If the bond is the path to unity. Another counselor added, then what does it mean when one exists outside it, without suffering, without longing? Elias scratched the back of his head. I'm standing right here, you know. You can just ask me. A flicker of displeasure passed through the chamber. Zivara barely held back a groan. Please, she muttered, stop talking. Elias made a zipping motion across his lips, then immediately ruined it by whispering,
Les deux fils
I just want to point out that telepathic conversations are extremely rude to outsiders. A younger counselor turned his sharp gaze to Elias. Would you not
jumeaux de vue brillaient à leur zénith, brûlant le
from the whole? Elias Elias tilted his head. Not really. I mean, I like knowing my embarrassing thoughts stay inside my own head. Unlike you guys, I can have a bad idea and not have the whole room experience it in real time. He glanced at Zivara. Seriously, imagine thinking, what if I licked that power conduit? And suddenly,
Đây có chỗ biểu thị là URL. Đó, mọi người có
a breathless laugh almost escaped her throat. The counselors did not share her amusement. The point, the eldest continued, ignoring Elias entirely, is that we have an opportunity to learn. You, Zivara, are an anomaly among us. But now we have
copy và nhấn up đi.
one who does not belong to us. Zivara's stomach tightened. She knew where this was going. You will form an experimental bond with the human. There it was.
Quay lại, copy từ khóa chính.
Though her mind raced. The council had never cared for her struggles before. They had dismissed her as unfortunate.
Tiếp tục bổ sung vào những phần có thể chỉnh sửa.
They wanted to study.
Mọi người làm chút một thôi thì sẽ không bị mất.
Did not immediately object. Instead, he rocked back,
Đó.
considering the offer. So, just to clarify, you want us to, what? Hold hands and sing Kumbaya until something clicks? Zivara's irritation flared. Do you ever take anything seriously? Of course, Elias said. Just not when I'm awake. One of the counselors gestured toward a sleek, hovering console embedded into the floor, its surface pulsing with shifting symbols. Our scientists have devised a neural interface, a conduit through which a mind like yours, Zivara, might attempt connection to another. The implication was clear. If her own people could not bond with her, perhaps she could bond with him. She felt her face heat with anger. Was that all she was to them? A failed experiment now repurposed into something useful? Elias folded his arms, gaze flicking between her and the console. So, worst case scenario, my brain melts, right? The youngest counselor nodded. There is a possibility of neural feedback destabilization, yes. Elias sighed. Yeah, that's what I thought. You guys need to work on your sales pitch. Zivara turned sharply to him. You can refuse. Elias met her gaze. So can you. She opened her mouth, then hesitated. Could she? Refusing meant confirming what the council already believed, that she was useless, a mistake, a loose thread in the fabric of their perfect society. She looked at the console, at Elias. He was watching her with that same unreadable expression he always wore. But beneath the humor, there was something else. Not pity, not disdain, just curiosity. And maybe, just maybe, a sliver of belief. She squared her shoulders. Fine, Elias grinned. Great, let's break some laws of biology. The neural interface was a complex machine, sleek and streamlined, its core embedded with shifting crystalline structures, designed to channel thought itself. Zivara sat in one of the two chairs, stiff and uncomfortable, while Elias sprawled in the other, as if it were a bar stool in some dive on the outer rim. You're taking this far too lightly, Zivara muttered. I cope with stress by pretending it doesn't exist, Elias said cheerfully. The technician adjusted the shimmering cables that connected them both to the machine. Zivara felt a faint hum in her skull, a distant pressure. Not quite pain, but not comfortable either. Then, the machine activated. A jolt shot through her mind, like stepping into freezing water, a sudden dizzying flood of something. But it wasn't the seamless, elegant connection of the Vishari bond. It was messy, fragmented, loud. Oh, hell. Okay, that's weird. Zivara, are you in my head? This is super weird. She gasped. It wasn't a thought stream. It wasn't a whispering tide of unity. It was him, his voice, but inside her skull, filled with motion, with fragments, and chaos. So much chaos. Why are there so many thoughts at once? She demanded. Yeah, welcome to being human. You think one thing, then another thing, then wonder if you left the stove on. She tried to steady herself, but his mind was everywhere. Flashes of memory, impressions of places she'd never seen, the faint, constant undercurrent of music, of words she didn't understand. You're terrible at this. It's my first time. Give me a break. And then, for the briefest moment, clarity. Not full synchronization, not a perfect bond, but something real. Zivara gasped. The council observed in silence. Elias, breathless, gave a crooked smile. Well, he said, that was interesting. And Zivara realized with a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning. The first few days of training were, to put it lightly, a disaster. Zivara had expected difficulty, but nothing could have prepared her for the sheer messiness of Elias Vance's mind. The Vishari had spent millennia refining their mental bonds, creating seamless thought-sharing that wove entire communities into a single, elegant consciousness. It was an art, a discipline, a sacred unity. Elias was a storm. Every session felt like plunging into a chaotic ocean. Unfiltered thoughts, fleeting images, random impulses that made no sense. She would catch glimpses of memories, only for them to scatter like startled birds. One moment, she'd sense his curiosity about her world. The next, she'd be assaulted by a memory of a song stuck in his head. Something about a spaceship shaped like a taco that she did not understand. Focus, she snapped, rubbing her temples after yet another failed session. I am focusing, Elias shot back, reclining in his chair. I just happen to be focusing on several things at once. Zivara exhaled sharply. That is not how this works. Maybe it's how I work. He tapped his temple. Human brains are like overstuffed filing cabinets, full of things we don't need. I can't just switch it off. Trust me, I wish I could. She groaned. Then we are doomed. Elias smirked. Well, that's a great attitude. The truth was, it wasn't just frustrating, it was exhausting. Zivara had spent her whole life being denied the connection her people took for granted. Now, she finally had something that resembled a bond, but it was crude and unstable, more like trying to hold onto a frayed rope in a windstorm than the seamless unity the Vishari achieved. And worse, she was starting to get used to it. That terrified her. All right, Elias said, stretching. Maybe we need to try something different. Zivara arched a brow. Different? He leaned forward. We keep doing this like it's supposed to be some perfect mind meld. What if we work with the chaos instead of against it? She folded her arms. And what does that mean exactly? Elias grinned. It means we take this mess of a connection and stress test it. See how far we can push it. Get into some real-world scenarios. She narrowed her eyes. Are you suggesting we abandon controlled conditions? I'm suggesting we actually do something, instead of sitting in a lab staring at each other. Zivara hesitated. It was reckless, unrefined, dangerous. But then again, so was Elias. The first test was simple. Synchronized movement. Or, at least, it should have been simple. The goal was to use their unstable connection to mirror each other's actions in real time. The Vishari did this effortlessly with their bonds, operating in perfect harmony. But when Zivara tried to step forward and guide Elias through the link, his brain refused to cooperate. Why are you hesitating? She sent through the bond. I'm not hesitating, you're just moving weird. She huffed. Follow my lead. I am following your lead. Then why are you moving in the wrong direction? Elias frowned. Wait, you're the one who moved wrong. Zyvera gritted her teeth. You are impossible. They stood in the training hall, both frozen mid-step, staring at each other as if the force of their glares alone could settle the debate. Then Elias chuckled. What? She asked, wary. I just realized. This is basically the worst dance lesson ever. She let out a sharp breath. I am not dancing with you. I don't know. I think we'd kill it at a ballroom competition. She groaned and turned away before she could be tempted to actually laugh. The next test was something Zyvera had suggested. Combat training. She thought it would be easier, at least in theory. She was a capable fighter, and Elias, despite his perpetual smugness, had a soldier's discipline when it came to battle. The idea was to use their connection to anticipate each other's movements, reacting in sync rather than as two individuals. It did not go as planned. The first match ended with Elias tripping over his own feet when he caught a stray fragment of Zyvera's focus at the wrong moment. The second ended when Zyvera misinterpreted one of Elias's impulsive human thoughts, something about a cool, spinning kick that resulted in her nearly falling flat on her back. By the third match, Elias was
Les deux fils jumeaux.
where he'd taken an accidental elbow strike. Well, he said, grinning through the pain, at least you hit something this time. Zyvera rolled her eyes. You are a fool. A fool with tenacity, Elias corrected. And, much to her own annoyance, she had to admit, he wasn't entirely wrong. The next morning, Zyvera was up before the sun, staring out over the city from her private chamber. Something had changed. She could still feel Elias in the back of her mind, not in the elegant, effortless way the Vishari bonded, but as a presence, a persistent, chaotic hum. It wasn't seamless.
Là từ khóa chính phải tùy chọn các phần chỉnh sửa được phép chỉnh sửa ít một. Trước đây
Perfect connection. Maybe it was about forging something new. She turned as the door behind her slid open. Elias leaned against the frame, arms crossed. Couldn't sleep either, huh? Zyvera gave him a tired look. You were projecting your dreams again. Oh? His grin widened. Anything interesting? She leveled a flat stare at him. You were dreaming about food, he gasped in mock horror. That is interesting. She pinched the bridge of her nose. I hate you. No, you don't, Elias said cheerfully. She huffed, turning back to the window. We try again tomorrow. Elias nodded. Tomorrow it is. And for the first time, Zyvera felt something strange. Not frustration, not anger, but something dangerously close to hope. The High Council's judgment chamber was silent, save for the rhythmic hum of the crystalline panels pulsing along the walls. Zyvera stood in the center, shoulders squared, her heartbeat an unsteady drum against her ribs. Elias was beside her, hands in his pockets, completely and utterly unfazed by the tension in the air. Or at least, appearing unfazed. Through their still imperfect bond, Zyvera could sense something, a flicker of nerves beneath his usual bravado, a readiness to act if things turned against them. And given how the Council's collective expression ranged from disapproval to outright disdain, that possibility was very real. You have defied our ways, the eldest counselor intoned. You have persisted in this experiment, despite clear warnings. Zyvera lifted her chin. And it has succeeded. A ripple of discontent coursed through the assembled council members. She felt it like a shifting...
có nhiều anh em là làm một loạt hết, điền một loạt hết, xong sẽ bị mất hết thông tin, nó sẽ không được đầy đủ. Đó, mọi người cứ làm một chút một. Đây là 5, mọi người điền cho mình là 5. Đấy, nhấn apply. Tiếp tục phần dưới này sẽ là tên kênh. Đây có chỗ biểu thị là URL. Đó, mọi người copy và nhấn apply. Quay lại, copy từ khóa chính.
Disagree. The council ignored Elias entirely, their focus still on her. The Vishari bond is sacred. It is absolute. Yours is neither. It is crude, imperfect, a lesser imitation of what we are meant to be. Zivara exhaled sharply. She had known this was coming. She had expected it. But this time, the weight of their words...
Tiếp tục bổ sung vào những phần có thể chỉnh sửa. Mọi người làm chút một thôi thì sẽ không bị mất. Đó. Rồi, thế là hết rồi đấy ạ. Mình chỉ cần tất cả đều là từ khóa chính. Có hai phần này là tên kênh và URL, còn lại là từ khóa chính. Mọi người nhấn OK. Sau đó mọi người có thể
For years, I believed your words, that I was lesser, that I was broken. She met their gazes, her voice steady. But I am not. The silence deepened. Zivara continued. The human mind does not work as ours do. Their thoughts are unrefined, messy, but they are not weak, and neither am I. She let her gaze sweep across the chamber. I have spent my life being told I do not belong, that no one would bond with me, and yet here I stand, with a bond of my own. She reached out, not with her mind, but with her hand, a gesture distinctly human. Elias, without hesitation, took it. The chamber filled with an almost tangible shock, a ripple of unspoken thoughts cascading through the council members. Elias smirked. So, what's the verdict? Do we get matching telepathic friendship bracelets? Or are we getting kicked out? Zivara suppressed a sigh. The council did not immediately answer. The eldest considered them both for a long, heavy moment before his voice resonated through the chamber. You have chosen your path, Zivara. The words carried weight.
kiểm tra lại, chuột phải kiểm tra lại. Đó, tất cả các thông tin từ khóa chính, tên kênh, URL đã được điền đầy đủ vào thông tin của file. Đó, đây là xong bước SEO thô video. Sau đó mình sẽ chuyển sang bước tải lên video.
A silent question. She didn't hesitate. I do not regret this. The council's gaze remained cold, but they did not detain them. There was no grand punishment, no spectacle. Simply a closing of the doors, a severance, a beginning. They walked out of the chamber in silence, stepping onto the long open walkway that stretched over the glowing cityscape. The sky was streaked with light from distant ships leaving the atmosphere, and the air smelled of charged energy and the faint metallic tang of the storm barrier beyond the city walls. Zivara inhaled deeply. It should have felt like loss, but it didn't. So, Elias said, rocking back on his heels, got any plans? Because personally, I think we should go get a drink before we start this whole renegade exile thing. Zivara glanced at him. You want to celebrate? He grinned. Damn right I do. We just told an entire psychic cult to shove their rules, and we won. She gave him a long look. We were exiled. Semantics. She exhaled sharply, but there was something light in her chest, something dangerously close to laughter. And, despite herself, she smiled. Elias caught it. Was that a smile? No. It was. Oh, this is a momentous occasion. She rolled her eyes. Come on, human. We have a ship to catch. Elias fell into step beside her, hands behind his head, grinning like a man who had never once regretted a single bad decision in his life. So, Zivara, now that we're partners in crime, do I get to pick the first destination? She arched a brow. If you say space casino, I will push you off this platform. Elias gasped. How dare you assume I was going to say... He paused. Okay, yeah, it was going to be a space casino. But hear me out. Zivara sighed, striding ahead toward the docks. I already regret this. No, you don't. She didn't. Not even a little. And as they stepped onto the waiting ship, leaving behind a world that had never accepted her, she realized something. For the first time in her life, she wasn't alone. And that was worth everything. The space station Haven's Edge floated in the void like a drunken satellite, its outer hull a patchwork of repairs from decades of questionable decision-making. It wasn't the grandest station in this sector. Hell, it wasn't even the fourth grandest, but it had three things going for it: decent food, cheap drinks, and a strict no-killing policy, which made it the perfect place for rival species to flex their egos without accidentally starting an intergalactic war. Ziara had no intention of flexing anything. She was Arinthian, a warrior by birthright, and trained since childhood to break bones with a flick of her wrist. Her people had evolved on a high-gravity world where weaklings didn't last past infancy. They were fast, powerful, and their bodies could take a hit that would pulp a lesser species. They weren't the biggest in the galaxy, nor the most technologically advanced. But when it came to physical prowess, few could match them. And humans? Oh, humans were a joke. Ziara had read about them, of course. Every military strategist worth their weight in plasma grenades knew about the species from Sol 3. They were stubborn survivors, sure, annoyingly persistent. But their biology was unimpressive. Brittle bones, laughably weak muscles, and organs so inefficient, it was a wonder they weren't extinct already. They were like those creatures back on Arinthia that survived by running away. Fast, clever, but ultimately prey. Which was why Ziara had trouble understanding why one was currently sitting at the bar, drinking what smelled like battery acid and eating something that was actively smoking. She squinted at him from across the room. The human was unimpressive, lean, casual, dressed in a plain flight jacket and cargo pants, like he had nowhere better to be. His hair was messy, his posture relaxed, and his focus entirely on the meal in front of him. The food, if it could be called that, glowed a faint green and hissed whenever his fork pierced it. What in the name of collapsing star clusters is that? Ziara muttered. The bartender, a squat amphibian with 3 eyes and 0 patience, overheard her and grunted. Human cuisine. They call it spicy. Ziara frowned. That sounded like a war crime, but curiosity got the better of her. She approached the bar, sliding onto the stool beside the human, her silver-hued skin gleaming under the dim neon lights. Tell me something, she said, watching as he took another bite of the bubbling, glowing monstrosity. How is it that your species has survived this long when you willingly ingest poison? The human barely glanced at her. He chewed, swallowed, and then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Oh, this? He gestured at his plate. This isn't poison. It's flare beetle curry. Ziara narrowed her eyes. It's steaming. That means it's working. It's hissing. That means it's fresh. Before Ziara could respond, the human popped another bite into his mouth and immediately turned an alarming shade of red. His eyes watered, and he made a noise that sounded suspiciously like a dying ship engine. Ziara leaned back. You seem unwell, the human gasped. He exhaled sharply, gripping the counter. I'm fine. It's just, wow. Okay, that's got a bit of a kick. Ziara tilted her head. Why do you consume things that hurt you? He coughed, took a deep breath, and then grinned at her. Because it makes life more interesting. Ziara stared at him. That was not an answer. And yet, it intrigued her. For all her training, all her knowledge of other species, there was something fundamentally strange about humans that she had never understood. They were too reckless, too chaotic. They invited discomfort, thrived on challenge. And right now, she wanted nothing more than to see what made them tick. It started as a simple taunt. Ziara hadn't intended to challenge him. Not really. She had only meant to test his awareness, to gauge whether humans had any sense of personal pride. But the moment she saw the amused glint in his eye, the easy smirk that tugged at his lips, she knew she had just stepped into something bigger. "What's it like?" she asked, swirling the drink in her hand. "Being so breakable?" The human raised an eyebrow. "Breakable?" "You bruise if the wind blows too hard," she said. "Your bones snap like dry twigs. Your lungs can barely handle a shift in atmospheric pressure. You require external tools to match the strength of other species. I've always wondered, what is it like knowing that nearly every creature in the galaxy could kill you with minimal effort?" The human considered her for a moment. Then he leaned forward, resting his elbow on the bar. "What's it like?" he said. "Having a superiority complex?" Ziara blinked. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." He grinned. "What's it like walking around, thinking you're the strongest thing in the room until—" He snapped his fingers. "You're not?" Ziara laughed. It was a sharp, sharp sound, a warrior's amusement. "That's an interesting fantasy you have, human." "Oh, it's not a fantasy," he stretched, cracking his neck. "It's just experience." Ziara studied him, suddenly intrigued in a way she hadn't expected. The way he spoke, the way he held himself. There was no fear, no hesitation. Curious. "You really believe that?" she asked. He shrugged. "I don't need to believe it. I already know it." Her lips curled into a smirk. "Then perhaps we should put that theory to the test." The human didn't even blink. "Thought you'd never ask." By the time word spread about the upcoming fight, Haven's Edge was buzzing with excitement. Arinthian versus human. Strength versus adaptability. Ziara was confident. Too confident. After all, what could a human possibly do to her? As she stood in the station's training ring, watching her opponent arrive, she didn't know the answer yet. But she was about to find out, and it would change everything. The crowd around the training ring had grown thick, a pulsing mass of spectators from every corner of the galaxy. Some were here for the spectacle, others for the betting pools. Most, however, were simply curious, because no one in the entire history of Haven's Edge had ever bet on a human before. The odds were spectacularly against Daniel Carter. Arinthians weren't just known for their strength, they were built for combat. Their skeletal density was nearly triple that of a human, their muscles packed with a fibrous elasticity that allowed them to generate enormous power with minimal effort. Arinthians weren't the fastest species, but they didn't have to be. Ziara rolled her shoulders, feeling the stretch of her tendons, the coil of power beneath her skin. This would be easy. She'd take him down fast, efficiently. A quick strike, a single throw, and he'd be on his back before he had time to realize what had happened. Across the ring, Daniel Carter looked unconcerned. He was stretching, like this was a warm-up, like he wasn't about to face someone who could throw him through a wall. Ziara narrowed her eyes. "You're oddly relaxed for someone about to lose." Daniel finished his stretch, straightened, and shrugged. "I'm oddly relaxed about a lot of things." "Your overconfidence is amusing. So is your arrogance." Ziara smirked. It's not arrogance, if it's based on facts. Daniel grinned. Then, let's test those facts, shall we? The station's AI referee, a hovering orb with a questionable grasp on morality, beeped loudly. Begin! Zyara moved. Erinthians weren't fast in a traditional sense, but their combat training compensated for it. Zyara's body snapped forward in a blur of controlled motion, her fist slicing through the air in a precise arc. But Daniel wasn't there. He was gone. She barely registered the shift before something slammed into her ribs. It wasn't a hard hit, more of a tap, really. But it was fast. A flicker of movement. A warning. She twisted, eyes narrowing. Daniel had already slipped back, hands loose, weight balanced. He's playing defensive? Zyara scoffed. You're avoiding me? Daniel cocked his head. You expected me to just stand there and get hit? That's what most people do. Well, I'm not most people. She came at him again, this time feinting left before cutting right, aiming a controlled strike at his center mass. A hit like this would knock the wind out of any creature with lungs. Daniel twisted. A second too early, a half-inch too close, but he moved. Her strike missed by a hair, grazing his jacket instead of his ribs. And then, pain. A sharp, jarring pressure against her side. Not enough to hurt, not really, but enough to stagger. What? Zyara barely had time to process the sensation before Daniel was already gone again. She exhaled sharply, recalibrating. This is fine. She was stronger, more durable. She just had to focus. She lunged again, fists blurring. Miss, hit. No. Dodge. Counter. Another tap, this time against her shoulder. Zyara snarled, He's toying with me. The fight stretched on. Zyara's frustration built like a plasma coil ready to blow. Daniel wasn't winning, not exactly. He wasn't hurting her, but he wasn't losing either. And that was infuriating. Zyara was used to fights lasting seconds. A blow, a fall, victory. This question mark, this was different. Daniel moved like smoke. Every strike she threw he anticipated. Every feint he countered. Every mistake, minor, imperceptible, he exploited. She was fighting a ghost. And worse, he was enjoying it. Halfway through a particularly frustrating exchange, Daniel grinned. You're good. Zyara barely stopped herself from growling. You are infuriating. Thank you. That was not a compliment. I'll take it anyway. She swung. He dodged. Again. She hated him. It took her nearly 5 minutes to understand the fundamental problem. She had underestimated humans, not their strength. He was still weaker than her, not their durability. His movements told her he knew he couldn't take a direct hit. It was something else, something worse. They adapted. Every move she made, he adjusted. He learned, quickly. Every failed attack, every missed strike, he absorbed like a sponge. His next movements just a fraction more efficient, a fraction more dangerous. This wasn't a fight against a lesser species. It was a fight against a predator. For the first time in years, Zyara felt something unfamiliar coil in her gut. Excitement, not irritation, not frustration. Pure, unfiltered excitement. Because she was losing. And that had never happened before. Daniel saw the shift in her stance. You okay there? She smiled. Actually smiled. Yes. And then she lunged again. Faster this time. Sharper. The crowd had gone silent. Minutes ticked by. The fight stretched into something almost unnatural. And then, in a blur of motion, it happened. Zyara overcommitted. It was subtle. A slight misstep. A miscalculation in weight. A minute shift that should have been insignificant. But Daniel caught it. And suddenly, she wasn't standing anymore. She was falling. And then, impact. The world flipped. The station's artificial gravity lurched. Ziara found herself on the ground, staring at the ceiling. Her lungs emptied in a stunned exhale. She didn't even know how he had done it. Above her, Daniel crouched, resting his forearms on his knees. "You okay?" he asked, the hint of a smirk tugging at his lips. Ziara blinked, and then she laughed. Low, rich, genuine. Because somehow, against every expectation, she had just lost to a human, and she needed to know how. Daniel grinned. "You fought well." He extended a hand. For an amateur, Ziara took it, because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Ziara still wasn't sure how it had happened. 1 second, she was dominating the fight. The next, she was on her back, staring at the ceiling like an idiot, while a human grinned down at her as if he had just pulled off a magic trick. She had been bested, outmaneuvered, by a fragile, slow-healing...
Tiếp tục phần dưới này sẽ là tên kênh. Đây có chỗ biểu thị là URL. Đó, mọi người copy và nhấn up đi. Quay lại, copy từ khóa chính. Tiếp tục bổ sung vào những phần có thể chỉnh sửa. Mọi người làm chút một thôi thì sẽ không bị mất. Đó. Rồi, thế là hết rồi đấy ạ. Mình chỉ cần tất cả đều là từ khóa chính. Có hai phần này là tên kênh và URL, còn lại là từ khóa chính. Mọi người nhấn OK. Sau đó mọi người có thể kiểm tra lại, chuột phải kiểm tra lại. Đó, tất cả các thông tin từ khóa chính, tên kênh, URL đã được điền đầy đủ vào thông tin của file. Đó, đây là xong bước xeo thô video. Sau đó mình sẽ chuyển sang bước tải.
"Tell me, human, how did you do that?" Daniel smirked. "What, win?" "Yes," he shrugged. "Simple. I learned faster than you did." Ziara's fingers tightened around her glass. "Impossible." Daniel tapped his temple. "Nah. See? That's the thing about humans. We're not the strongest, we're not the fastest, but we adapt." He set his drink down. "You came in expecting me to fight like a brute, but humans don't fight like that. We don't just overpower things. We learn their patterns, find their weaknesses, and..." He snapped his fingers. "We adjust." Ziara stared at him, her warrior's mind turning over the idea. She had trained against countless species, some faster, some bigger, some nearly indestructible. But none had done what Daniel had just done. None had learned in real time. The bar around them was still buzzing with energy. A few of the regulars kept sneaking glances their way, some in shock, others in amusement. Somewhere in the background, Ziara overheard a reptilian merchant taking bets on whether or not she'd challenge Daniel to a rematch. Spoiler, she absolutely would. But first, she needed answers. "You mean to tell me," she said, crossing her arms, "that all humans are like this?" Daniel thought about it for a moment, then grinned. "Nah, most humans aren't great fighters, but the good ones?" He leaned in slightly. "They're terrifying." Ziara narrowed her eyes. "Why?" "Because we don't play fair." She snorted. "So you admit you cheat?" "Nope," Daniel smirked. "I admit we're clever." Ziara had to admit, there was something disturbingly effective about Daniel's approach. Arinthians were taught how to fight. Every technique, every counter, every strike was measured, precise. She had spent years honing her form, perfecting the art of combat. Humans? They just winged it. And somehow, that worked. Ziara shook her head. "Your fighting style is chaotic." Daniel shrugged. "It's efficient. It's sloppy. It's unpredictable." She scowled. He had a point. Their conversation was interrupted when a hulking insectoid creature. "Ziara of Arinthia, I want a rematch."
How can I be a competent queen? I must develop my city carefully. Agricultural irrigation is definitely a priority. Dig a canal to water the crops. Trade development is also essential. This way, we'll always have a steady stream of resources. Next is the military. Powerful weapons can better protect my people. The nation will flourish under my rule. The Grand Pyramid is a symbol of our nation's strength. And these statues, they symbolize my power and prestige. Under my rule, the country has grown stronger and more prosperous.
Trụ lại 3 tháng, cuối cùng lên quận thành. Hôm nay chúng ta sẽ chiếm Kinh Châu. Trước tiên phải trinh sát đi thăm dò thực lực Kinh Châu. Ô, tình báo tới rồi. Dạ, Lưu Biểu quả thực rất mạnh. Mưu của Khoái Lương, Khoái Việt, võ của Ngụy Diên, Hoàng Trung, Văn Phi, mã bộ binh 10 vạn. Khó chơi rồi đây. Hay là ngoại giao trước xem sao? Xem có thể tìm được đồng minh không? Thực hiện chiến lược hợp tung liên hoành, viễn xa cận công. Ồ, mặt này Tôn Quyền đã đồng ý liên minh rồi. Hai bên sẽ thực hiện giao thương hữu nghị. Giờ thì ngon rồi. Lập tức phái đại tướng Lữ Bố tấn công Kinh Châu.